Vermont, talking with Murray Bookchin. And Murray, you're in your 73rd year, and you've been a revolutionary since the 1930s. You were talking earlier about handing out pamphlets in the streets during the labor movement. You were in Spain in the 60s doing research on the Spanish anarchist movement.
In the 60s.
In the 60s, yes. Could you share with us some of your background, how you became involved in revolutionary activities?
Well, I'd say that my revolutionary experience, if I can use that, goes back practically to Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution. In fact, even before the 1905 revolution in Russia. I can't say how long my family was living in southern Russia. It may have been every bit of 500 to 1,000 years, I don't know. But I was very greatly influenced, quite obviously, by my grandparents, and particularly by my grandmother, who was born around 1860, way back in what is today called Moldavia, but in her day was called Bessarabia. It was under Tsarist control. And they lived on the border of Romania, or possibly Austro-Hungary, it was called, Austria-Hungary. And in those days, back in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, into the 1890s, they had a movement called the Narodniki, which meant the populace. They're most famous, for example, for having executed Alexander II. They were called the People's Will, Narodnaya Volya. And my grandmother, however far removed she was from the center of Russia, possibly about 1,500 miles away from Moscow, or what was then later on to be called Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and Leningrad, be another 2,000 miles, nonetheless belonged to that whole movement of the Jews emancipating themselves from tradition, the Jewish Enlightenment it was called, or the Haskalah. And both she and my grandfather, whom I never knew, were Russian socialists, populist socialists, sort of on the anarchistic side. And they migrated, both my grandmother, after my grandfather died, and my mother and her brother, my uncle, to the Lower East Side, where they became more involved in the Russian labor movement, emigrant labor movement, than in the Yiddish or Jewish traditions of the Lower East Side. And they belonged to Russian workers' clubs, choruses. There was a very rich life that unfortunately we no longer know in our own time today in the 1990s. They didn't have telephones, they didn't have typewriters, they didn't have radios, and they didn't have television sets. So people continually mingled with each other. There was a very rich street life, and there was a very rich radical choral groups. There were very rich, very attractive lectures being given. Emma Goldman would come around, Eugene V. Debs would come around, Big Bill Haywood of the IWW would come around and continually lecture, as well as less luminous figures in those days. And in a great sense, in a very real sense, I guess they were part of the Russian workers' movement. And when, of course, the Russian Bolsheviks took over under Lenin and Trotsky, everybody became a Bolshevik. It didn't make any difference whether you were a Marxist or an anarchist or a social democrat, you know, if you were enthusiastic about the overthrow of the Tsar and the Red Flag and the Internationale, which became the official anthem of the newly emerging Soviet Union, you became a Bolshevik. You didn't have to read too much about it to know which side you were on. So when I was born, at the very beginning of 1921, and while the revolution, in effect, was still going on to some extent, I was completely suffused in this whole atmosphere of revolutionary dreams, very revolutionary visions, people talking enthusiastically about what was happening in the world, because it seemed like the world was going to transform itself completely. And I felt that energy, which remained with me well through the 1920s. In fact, the very first language, even though I was born in the United States, that I could speak with any fluency was Russian, which I've totally forgotten by and large. And the heroes and heroines that I saw all around me were pictures of Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht in the German Revolution, heroic figures from the Russian Revolution and the Russian revolutionary past. In fact, before I even knew the name of Robin Hood, I heard of Stenka Razin, who rose up in the 1600s against Tsarism, the Russian Cossack who led great masses of people against Tsarism, and then still later, a century or so, Emelian Pugachev's great uprising. And so I had a better picture of revolutions in Russia than I did of anything in the United States, which ultimately, of course, so far as the United States is concerned, I gradually assimilated as I went to school and began to mingle with also first-generation Americans, generally in a Jewish, socialist, or communist neighborhood of New York. New York at that time was made up of 1,000 villages. My parents, in point of fact, both father and mother, were proletarians in the real sense of the word. They worked in the garment district at a time when the unions were being organized. And they were also members of the industrial workers of the world when it was still the industrial workers of the world and not a mere remnant or a shadow of what exists today under that name. And now, is in San Francisco instead of being in Chicago, which is where it originally was located. And so quite naturally, I assimilated a good many revolutionary notions, becoming an atheist at the age of 6, a vegetarian between 6 and 14. These ideals were very ubiquitous all over. They were present all over the place. Listened continually and learned stories and accounts about the Russian Revolution by people who fought in it, not just people who read about it in newspapers or in books. And by the age of 9 or so, I was actually recruited. 1930, no later than 1931, I was actually recruited in the children's organization of the Communist Party, the Young Pioneers of America, and went through that in one of the most hectic periods of American communism. That period was one of continual insurgency. The Communist Party and the Communist International, despite the fact that Stalin was coming to power, and his power wasn't absolutely assured as yet. It was not to be assured until 5 or 6 years later, with the Moscow trials when he killed off all the old Bolsheviks. But before that period, between, say, 1930 or 31 and 1935, the United States, the Communist Party and the Communist movement generally in the United States was in its most insurrectionary phase. We'd go from one demonstration to another demonstration and fight the police in New York City. And with the Depression, we had great hunger marches. Thousands would rally in various parts of New York and march towards City Hall, New York City Hall, with bread banners and slogans like, "We want bread, not war," or "We want butter, not guns." Slogans that you could have heard in 1848 or in 1789 in the French Revolution. In other words, it was easier for us in those days to communicate more comfortably with someone who had been on the June barricades in Paris, workers who had been on the June barricades in Paris under the red flags of 1848, than it would have been to talk to someone today, or even to, contemporaries or people younger, a generation later than my own, or 2 generations later than my own, who were to make up the new left. So that old left that everybody talks about had some very limiting features about it, but it also had enormously expansive features about it. It had a rich musical heritage. It felt it was really completing the French Revolution. of 1789 to 1794. And we all modeled ourselves, even the Bolsheviks in Russia modeled ourselves on the French Revolution, the whole cycle of the revolution. We thought in terms of a class struggle of the working class, the proletariat, industrial proletariat, which was very numerous at that point in the United States. In the 1920s, the assembly line had come in. We didn't have that before, not quite in the form that Henry Ford produced. And workers and unions and everything like that, and workers' parties, the word worker, proletarian, was on everybody's lips. So it was a period in which we had a very coherent analysis of the working class taking power, establishing a proletarian dictatorship, which we thought would be more democratic, in fact, than the American Bill of Rights, for example, because now the people would control the press, not the oligarchical few capitalists. And we saw workers in action. They were really doing revolutionary things, so it seemed to us. It's not only that they were going out on strike, it's not only that workers were very deeply class conscious, an amazing phenomenon that people have forgotten about today. Workers knew that they were workers. They called themselves labor. They called themselves workers, and in the most radical cases they called themselves proletarians, and that would not have been alien to most workers in industry, mines, in many cases even craft-type workers. We used to have cigar workers working right out in the open in little cigar stores wrapping leaves of tobacco. We had craftsmen all over. We didn't have, incidentally, the giant supermarkets and the corporate type of retail outlets that we have today. In those days, everything was a mom-and-pop store. And you knew everyone in the neighborhood. We also had open-air meetings, soapbox meetings, as they used to be called, where regularly, almost every day of the week, if the weather was reasonably clement, somebody would be on a stand talking about revolutionary ideas and talking about all kinds of class issues, dealing with class struggle, with socialism, with communism. And unfortunately, at that point, we didn't have very much anarchism around. The anarchist movement had more or less been overshadowed by the communists and the socialists. Remember well that in 1932, in the depths of the Depression, Norman Thomas, the socialist candidate for president, got more votes, almost 1 million votes, than Eugene V. Debs did in 1912, which was regarded as the heyday of American socialism, and that the communists got another 160 or 170,000. So you see, these were big, sizable movements that were very much in the public eye, however small the membership was. And also, finally, in the 1930s, it seemed like everything was going to be fulfilled. All our dreams as Marxists and as revolutionaries were going to be fulfilled. Terrible as the Depression was for so many people in the United States, for us it was something different that had meaning. The Depression, despite the economic deprivation, every one of us felt very personally. And I saw my furniture in the house out on the street every 3 months because of rental evictions, which was a standard routine during the Depression. At times you'd see a whole block covered, the sidewalks covered with the furniture of people who were being evicted from their apartments for non-payment of rent. And I knew what it meant to go hungry, even for several days. The point is that despite this kind of material deprivation that many of us radicals in those days felt, particularly communists and socialists, and I guess anarchists, we still felt exhilarated. In 1934, for example, the Austrian workers broke out in an insurrection. Workers, classical socialist party workers in Vienna, raised red flags and fought against the Dollfuss regime, which suppressed their insurrection. You see a touch of that in the movie Julia, when Jane Fonda comes to Vienna, and you see the workers with their hands on their heads and guarded by the steel helmets, as they were called. And then again, you had another insurrection about 8 months later in Spain. I'm not talking of the Spanish Civil War. I'm talking of the uprising of the Asturian coal miners, who held cities like Oviedo for 3 weeks against the Spanish Foreign Legion, one of the most brutal military forces that existed in the world at that time. We felt the upheavals going on in Germany, and we had echoes of Italian anti-fascists who had fought Mussolini and were in exile. And then, of course, came that greatest of all events, one of the greatest in history, in my opinion, one of the very greatest, the Spanish Revolution of 1936, when one of the biggest anarcho-syndicalist movements, the CNT, National Confederation of Labor, with its anarchist adjunct, or vanguard, if you like, and they use the words, anarchists use the words vanguard, words like vanguard, the FAI, or the Iberian Anarchist Federation, which altogether probably influenced at least 1 million people out of 24 million. I mean, where do you find an anarcho-syndicalist movement that large with its black and red flag, which has since been emulated in Latin America by the Sandinistas and others? The black standing for anarchy, the red standing for syndicalism, or workers' control of the factories. I mean, they collectivized a huge portion of the Republican area in the northeast of Spain, put it in established workers' control, established workers' committees to take over factories. In fact, the greater part of the factories in Catalonia, the northeastern stronghold of the anarcho-syndicalists, were taken over by the unions. See, and private property, to the extent that it existed, was very carefully controlled. Those inspiring events shaped our outlook so that when the war came, we expected that the Second World War would be a continuation of the First World War. We thought it was just another imperialist war, and we were indoctrinated into believing. By this time, by the way, I had broken with the Stalinists, the Communist Party, and I drifted over to Trotskyism. But we thought at that point, by 1939 and 1940, that the Second World War wouldn't even last as long as the First World War, that it would end as the First World War had in workers' insurrections. In fact, we saw in the darkness of the Second World War the beginning, we thought, of the glow of a new society. This would be it, the end of capitalism. Capitalism had gone through its chronic crisis of the 1930s, as Marx had predicted, and now, steeled with the more advanced ideas than even existed before the First World War, no longer social democrats, but one or another form of Bolshevism, committed to one or another form of Bolshevism, in this case Trotskyism, that the war would end very shortly in proletarian revolutions, a socialist United States of Europe, and maybe even of America. Well, it didn't happen. That requires a whole separate analysis by itself. In fact, Leon Trotsky, who was our teacher at that time, told us that if we did not get what we wanted, and he unfortunately died in 1940 at the very beginning of the war, or virtually at the beginning of the war, then we have to analyze everything. Why is it that capitalism could carry through a war like this? 5 years? German workers fighting right up to Hitler's bunker, defending him? No general strikes that we knew of in Germany? National struggles rather than international struggles? And class struggles? So coming out of that period, I felt personally, and as I felt, I'm sure many of my comrades at that time felt, that we had to make a fundamental reappraisal. We had to completely review all our basic theories, all our notions about the working class, all our notions about capitalism. How strong was it? We thought it was very weak. We thought it was on the point of collapse, both during the Depression and in the Second World War. But it came out stronger than ever, at least in the United States. In fact, we began to see the death of the old left by 1948. The Communist Party began to fracture up after the Henry Wallace campaign, the Progressive Party campaign of 1948. So we had to reconsider our position.
How much of that do you think is attributable, the continuation and proliferation of capitalism, attributable to the West playing the Germans against the Russians in the Second World War and the Russians against the Germans?
The Allies, to begin with, United States, Britain, Free French, and whatever, first of all, made it very difficult for the Germans to do anything, the German people. They demanded unconditional surrender. so that the German people were faced with either one of two alternatives: Hitler and their own national sovereignty, or, as the Allies very bluntly told them, they'd break up Germany. They'd literally break up Germany. They'd reduce Germany or return Germany to where it was before the French Revolution, with all its little duchies and cities and whatever you like, and maintain complete Allied surveillance of German life in every respect. In fact, we were told that we shouldn't fraternize with the Germans. Our troops shouldn't even talk to German women except to give orders, or talk to men and children except to give orders, you see. It wasn't giving out chocolate, if you please. Chocolate was okay in France, but it was not okay once you crossed the Rhine. The main thing is to deal with the Germans correctly, coldly, and indifferently, and let them know that they were a subject population, so that if there were any possibility of a German revolution, okay, then the Allies saw to it that that was completely muted, and literally redirected whatever the energy of the German people may have been, redirected toward Hitler, who at least gave them a sense of a national identity. The Russians, so-called Soviets, the Red Army, was totally nationalistic. It did not try to fraternize at all with the Germans the way Lenin had tried to do in the First World War. The Germans were dealt with as complete enemies. German soldiers were treated or sent to gulags by and large, and many of them perished there. A very high percentage of them died, never returned. Raped German women. I'm not trying to make an apology, by the way, for the Nazis. I beg you to understand that this was not at all the case. But the Russians did not carry on a revolutionary war the way Lenin had. You see, Lenin had called for, "Comrade Germans, we are all workers, join us to make a world socialist revolution." Stalin said the Germans are enemies. He went back to the knights of the medieval German knights to point out that the Germans were basically a vicious anti-Slavonic people, you see. And the Internationale, which had been the anthem of the Soviets right up to the middle of the war, was dropped and replaced by a Motherland Russia nationalistic anthem. And finally, you know, the whole approach of both sides, all three, the Axis, notably Germany, as well as Italy, the Western Allies, and the so-called Soviets, dealt with this war as though it were totally a war of national liberation, not as a class war, which is what Lenin called for. But I think that would understate, that would not sufficiently cover, in my opinion, the outcome of the war. It does not fully explain the outcome of the war. The point is basically that, to a great extent, we may have misread capitalism's virility, its strength, its internal strength. Capitalism, internally speaking, was much stronger than we ever realized. The 1930s was, in fact, a throwback in American history, so far as I'm concerned, to, say, the 1880s. Because suddenly, after the flapper era of the 1920s, when even Western Union kids used to invest in the stock market and call up their broker, and everybody was into the image of an American dream that would be so utterly affluent that everybody would become a capitalist, and was taught to believe that each one was a capitalist. The Depression of the 1930s seemed to suddenly stop everything. The stock market not only crashed and people were wiped out, banks were wiped out, people lost their savings. The New Deal came in. It really did not pull America completely out of the Depression by a long shot. It just created a kind of dead era of millions of unemployed who were on WPA or Works Progress Administration, building pools, post offices, and whatever you like. And nobody seemed to be in a decent economic condition at all. Everything seemed to be dead. With the least resurgence, immediately the trade union movement swept across the United States. I was personally active in my own way as a member of the Young Communist League in 1936 and 37, almost up to 38, which was around the time that I began to break with the Stalinists, as we used to call the members of the Communist Party and Young Communist League. I was involved in the trade union movement. I did organizing. I went out to northern New Jersey. We were recruited, all the older chaps, mainly in the Young Communist League, to come out and man picket lines, as it were. I'm not trying to be gender in my orientation, but that's the way it was called. Give out leaflets, get beaten up by police. So I did a good deal of that in northern New Jersey, even when I was going to high school, and certainly when I completed high school. It was a period in the 1930s as well of general strikes. There was a general strike in San Francisco, which Harry Bridges and the Longshoremen led, closing down the whole city. There was another one around the same year, 1934, led by Trotskyists, believe it or not, who controlled the Transport Workers Union. You know, Jimmy Hoffa's, what Jimmy Hoffa later inherited when the Trotskyist leadership was wiped out by Franklin D. Roosevelt around 1942 and sent off to jail on a Subversives Act, the Smith Act, if I'm not mistaken, which the communists applauded. You know, now that Russia was invaded, the communists came out in favor of the war, where before they were against it during the Stalin-Hitler Pact, and applauded Marxists being sent to prison on an act, piece of legislation that was to be used against them barely 10 years later by McCarthy. There's the irony, you know, a lesson to be learned, if you please. So that the very legislation that the communists applauded in sending Trotskyists to prison in 1942 because they were opposed to the war became the very means that McCarthy used to send communists to prison around the period of the Korean War, 1950, 51, 52, and so on and so forth. And although we definitely opposed what McCarthy was doing at that time, I didn't exactly feel, shall we say, that my heart was being wrenched open when I could have been imprisoned for the very, with the approval of the Stalinists or communists, that they were now being sent to jail with. So the point is, at the end of the war, you see, a sort of period came to an end for me. It was one that I had to rework in my own mind very carefully, and well, it lays the basis for understanding what I think now. And that is, I had to reevaluate what was valid and what was not valid in Marxism, which I had adhered to right up to 1945. I had to also ask myself, in saying what is valid in Marxism, is what is true about capitalism. Is capitalism going to destroy itself or self-destruct because it would bring workers to a state of such poverty as Marx had predicted, such a general chronic crisis as Marx had predicted in Capital, such that the workers would be forced to rise up against the capitalist class and establish socialism? There was no sign that the workers were going to do that, not even in a Europe that had lost the greater part of some 60 million people in a war far bloodier than the war that had given rise to the Russian Revolution in 1917. Germany was like a graveyard. The German proletariat was, in a span of only a few years, was not anti-Nazi in any active sense of the word, not to speak of the middle class, which was still pro-Nazi. What about the Italian workers? Sure, there were great big communist parties, but the workers were completely absorbed into the communist parties of France, of Italy, not of Germany, to be sure. And the Labour Party came to power in England, but they weren't doing anything. They were not transforming capitalism. So I had to consider very carefully, especially after 1948, when the American Communist movement took a nosedive, lost its big trade union base, which it acquired in the 1930s, as a result of the Taft-Hartley law and Philip Murray of the CIO driving out the communist unions and destroying them, and looking over the American scene, everybody suddenly getting back into capitalism again. The class consciousness that I knew about in the 1930s was already beginning to die out. I was in the 1940s. Just around the same year, in 1948, I think it was. I'm not too sure which year I'm talking about because I was in the military for a while and I'm confused one way or the other. We had a huge strike in General Motors, and I happened at that point to have been an auto worker in GM. And although we weren't on the actual assembly lines. I had done the real hard work of my life as a foundryman in the 1940s when I worked in New Jersey as a molder and as a helper in a foundry. The workers came back from that strike as though they became civil servants, as though they had been given civil service jobs with all kinds of benefits, safety nets, and so forth. And trade union democracy in the United Automobile Workers, for which the United Automobile Workers was famous, began to disappear. Walter Reuther, who took over the UAW, United Automobile Workers, got rid of the shop steward system. And we now started having professionals going around on carts, paid by the company no less, union grievance men paid by the company no less, going around settling grievances. And the president of our local being paid by the company, no longer being paid by the union. Everything now became muddled. Labor and capital were joined together in happy union. The radicals of yesterday took off their union buttons if they were workers and just discarded them and started to think of, getting out into the suburbs, replacing trolley cars by not even buses, their own private cars. Detroit, for example, changed completely. A real community at one point in the 1930s with trolley cars. Suddenly the trolley cars disappeared, buses replaced them, and then the workers themselves started to move out into the suburbs. They began to develop middle-class values where before they were stridently class-conscious, and now they were very emphatically super-patriotic. The McCarthy period guaranteed that. And on top of that, most incredibly, they began to live like middle-class people and stop thinking in class-conscious terms. But you've got to, the reason why I'm presenting this whole tableau is to explain how ideas are born, you see, and specifically, in this case, my own ideas. I have gone through a lived process of seeing the working class movements die out or become purely economic, which meant working within the system for contracts that gave them better, higher wages, better vacations, perhaps better working conditions, but still operating within the system. There were no longer any general strikes anymore, you see. No longer any real evidence of class consciousness. In fact, I recall one strike leader declaring in the 1950s, us middle-class workers. And that floored me. I never had heard workers in the 1930s, their snap caps and militancy call themselves middle class. They took pride in the fact that they were working class, that they were the muscles of the labor movement and so forth. And they were really belligerent. They didn't sit around and sing, "We shall overcome." They went right at the police with their own planks and nails and whatever you could think of, and rocks. And the police returned, answered in turn with tear gas and sometimes outright shooting into the crowd, as occurred in 1937 in the Memorial Day massacre out in Chicago, where they actually fired into a crowd of strikers and killed about half a dozen or a dozen of them and wounded another 30 or so. This was gone. So I had to ask myself, one, I did not want to become a social democrat. Nothing would convince me of becoming a social democrat. I was going to remain a revolutionary. Two, I had to ask myself, what could I learn? Well, the Russian Revolution had degenerated so appallingly that it became notorious that Russian marshals, field marshals and generals and whatever you like were all spoofed up, almost like the Nazis were, with all kinds of spaghetti and medals and everything on their chests. The Russian army began to goose step. What had happened to the revolution? Russian trade unions were completely suppressed. Stalin was manically purging everybody. People do not recall, and before he died, that Stalin was on the point of starting a mass purge of I don't know how many people, particularly of Jews in Russia. Capitalism had come out of the war stronger than ever. The United States' economy was literally burgeoning. And yet, what would I do? Should I go to the right and drift off in the direction of certain periodicals, notoriously social democratic, or maybe should I join the National Review, as the former Trotskyist James Burnham did, and sit cheek to jowl with Buckley, or Jay Lofstone, at one time General Secretary of the Communist Party, becoming what amounted to, in the eyes of many people anyway, a CIA agent, working with George Meany of the American Federation of Labor and the CIO to build anti-radical unions in Europe. That's what they were actually doing to a great extent. Should I become practical? Practical by living within the system and learning how to reform it, as well as improve my own income, perhaps, and my own living standards. And I had every opportunity to do that, incidentally. And I said, well, what's the point? If I'm going to be political, I want to be political as a revolutionary. The society is irrational. By those days, I was also thinking a great deal about how capitalism was changing other things in life. And one of the things it was beginning to do was to drastically change the whole environment, the so-called natural environment in which we live. Eisenhower went off on a great big binge of building superhighways. For the first time, we began to see highways that had so many lanes in them you couldn't count them. With figure eights and the rest of that, we all know what happened to Los Angeles. The trolley was replaced by all the freeways, and with that came the appalling air pollution that marks Los Angeles and all other American cities. I saw Robert Moses in New York cut right through parks that I played in as a youngster with huge superhighways. The mom-and-pop stores began to disappear. Not that they've totally disappeared, but they began to disappear, and we began to see first AMP, and then Grand Union, and then finally Price Chopper, and whatever you can think of. Huge shopping malls appearing in areas in New Jersey that were completely agricultural. The parking space was larger than the shopping mall itself, with giant highways coming in. And additionally, I began to see chemicals being used for everything. The country was gung-ho, almost zapped out in 1949, 50, and 51 on the idea that technology was going to bring us all the wonders in the world. For example, take nuclear power. Everybody was horrified by the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Then immediately, the Atomic Energy Commission, now known as the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to soothe things down in these lovely changes of expression in the Department of Energy, not the Department of War, which later was changed to the Department of Defense. I mean, they learned a whole new vocabulary, by the way. Nuclear energy was going to bring us unlimited power. Well, I didn't believe that. First of all, I didn't want it, mainly because I was very deeply concerned with nuclear wastes. And this became very evident in 1954, when they dropped an H-bomb in the Pacific that killed 2 Japanese fishermen. 1954, it was the first thermonuclear bomb they blew off. Now, at that time, I belonged to a group that was essentially outside the traditional left completely. They were called the Contemporary Issues Group, named after a magazine, Contemporary Issues. They had formerly been Trotskyists, most of them, who decided that we, as I felt, had to make a total reappraisal about what the war meant. And I was working with this group, helping turn out a magazine, beginning in 1948 and onward. And when they dropped an H-bomb, or they exploded an H-bomb somewhere out in Bikini Atoll, whatever it was called, I don't know, one of the islands out there, which caused an uproar in part because 2 Japanese fishermen who were dusted by the fallout died, and others became ill. I sat down and I wrote a leaflet called Stop the Bomb. Gave out I and the group gave out about 20,000 of it in New York. And we sent copies of that leaflet out to Japan, and the largest Japanese daily, with a circulation of 9 million readers, turned that leaflet into a Japanese translation and printed it on page 3. 9 million Japanese read it. And suddenly we were flooded with hundreds of letters by Japanese who could write to us in English, calling upon us to continue our efforts. Now, it's very important, I think, for people to know a few things. One, the peace movement itself at that time mainly emphasized the peaceful atom as against the warlike atom. What I mean by that is that the peace movement believed that nuclear power was dangerous as a weapon to wipe out cities. They gave very little attention, if at all, to fallout and the debris of nuclear explosions, or, for that matter, nuclear power. So to attack fallout at that particular point was, by implication, to attack nucleonics generally, not just as a weapon, but as the so-called peaceful atom or nuclear power plant. And this leaflet really produced a profound effect upon many of the peace activists that I knew. I remember A.J. Mussey, who was regarded as the father of the peace movement in America. My friend Dave Dellinger calls him the divine A.J. Died some years back, quite a few years back, but told me personally that that leaflet had completely changed his thinking on nuclear energy. As to say, not only the bomb that we had to worry about, said A.J. to me, you were right, we have to worry about even nuclear power. And early on, I may tell you, the group that I was associated with made a big fuss about the dangers of nuclear power. There was a major accident that occurred in England in 1956, in which widespread radioiodine swept over Western Europe. And this contemporary issues group in England, as well as my own group in the United States, made a big fuss about this. So very early on, it became very clear to me that new issues, capitalism was producing new issues. It was not simply producing economic issues, important as these always are, always are. It was not only producing economic problems and dislocations, it was producing environmental issues, or more precisely, ecological issues. And that awareness, partly of my own, partly of our group, caused me to write about this. I wrote a number of works under the name of Louis Herber. One of them was The Problem of Chemicals in Food, which was printed as early as 1952. Now, you must remember that that is almost 42 years ago. And it was a book-sized work. And it not only went into the dangers of pesticides and the abuse of antibiotics, they were putting them in ice in those days, antibiotics, to keep fish, as it were, preserved, while these giant fishing vessels with their enormous nets and everything could stay out in the ocean for an almost seemingly an indefinite period of time. And they were using hormones, which they were injecting, female estrogenic hormones, which they were injecting into poultry and into cattle to fatten them up, which we now know are carcinogens. And they were using food coloring matter on a lavish scale, basically coal tar dyes, which were known to be derived from cancer-causing substances. So I wrote this whole article, which easily made a small book, comprised a small book, and was to be published in Germany 2 years later as a book, under the pen name of Louis Herber, called The Problem of Chemicals in Food. And there I raised the basic issue that technology, and specifically chemicals, were today being used in agriculture, in food preparation, and in other such synthetic matters because of an ideology of dominating the natural world. You see, I tried to broaden that. I didn't want to just stick to an inventory of chemicals, which were easy to attack later on, and then call for food and drug legislation that would improve the situation. Because I argued basically, and this is where I do take a certain measure of pride, that ultimately the idea of dominating nature comes from the domination of people. And this idea was, for me at any rate, very, very fulfilling in a sense. So that is to say, it answered some real questions in my mind about what had happened as a result of the Second World War. The labor movement was gone. It was not going to play a revolutionary role. That doesn't mean that I was against the labor movement. That doesn't mean that I wanted to put down the labor movement. I didn't believe it was like a vanguard. I believed that it was part of the rest of the population, and that capitalism, first of all, as a result of its impact on the environment, okay, capitalism was going to generate new issues, not strictly economic ones, important as the economic always are. And people never forget that I keep emphasizing that the economic are important. What happens in the ghettos, what happens among the poor, what happens among the unstable middle classes today who don't know where their futures lie, are not small issues to me at all. They always are part of my way of thinking. But there was something new that was coming out. And that new thing was ecology. That capitalism, because of Marx's very notion that it must forever grow or die, expand and swallow up, or itself be swallowed up. Every capitalist enterprise faced with that problem must, therefore, continually turn soil into sand in agribusiness. It must turn soil into concrete, expanding highways and in cities. It must turn forests into matchsticks or newspaper print. And I said that these drives in capitalism were pitting society, and specifically capitalist society, although not only capitalist society, and we can go into that, that's another subject, but pitting society inexorably against the integrity of the natural environment. And that this was undermining this, forever churning the organic into the inorganic, reducing it, diminishing it, was, in this respect, simplifying the planet as well as poisoning it. I stressed simplification as emphatically as I could. Well, around 1939 or 38, a disaster happened in the United States. The cranberry crop was poisoned right on Thanksgiving, almost 1 week before Thanksgiving Day. I mean, this was sacrilege. The cranberry crop was poisoned either by a herbicide or a pesticide, and people had to run around looking for cranberries to make cranberry sauce with their turkeys on Thanksgiving Day. And I said, here's a lesson that people will not forget. Let me write something on it. So I started out and I wrote a whole book called Our Synthetic Environment, where I went through all the kinds of diseases you can get without any doctors being able to diagnose it, where I went through the whole question of simplifying the planet, where I went through agriculture and demanded that we turn more and more toward organic forms of agriculture. Now, you've got to know that hardly anybody was talking about this. And I take great pride in that fact, that, you know what I mean, that these were fairly innovative ideas. And I talked about the way in which we were raising not only crops, but poultry, beef, animals in general, farm animals, as well as the cruelty, the stresses we were suffering in urban life, the problems being produced by nuclear reactors and radiation. I went through the whole gamut of everything that could be wrong with our society and interpreted it from an ecological viewpoint and related it to, essentially, the need to grow or die, and finally concluded with the chapter called Decentralization. And here I take a great deal of pride in something. I advocated the use of solar energy, wind power, water power, geothermal energy, alternative forms of energy to fossil fuels and nuclear fuels. And that's just right at the end of it. And called for an entirely new dispensation, a new society, basically, to live in harmony with the natural world, and using these alternative techniques. I feel it's only fair to add that MIT had dismissed Massachusetts Institute of Technology after exploring solar energy years ago, had dismissed it and said it was utterly worthless and you couldn't use it. It couldn't compete with fossil fuels. That wind power had been abandoned after an attempt was made at Grandpa's Knob during the early part of the Second World War to test the possibilities of wind power. It was written off. And I argued And I can say, at least that was reasonably innovative. I argued for an alternative technology, or what I called an eco-technology. And I made this blanket condemnation of the whole relationship of capitalism to the environment. In 1962, it was published by Knopf, one of the most outstanding publishers in the United States, Alfred A. Knopf, at that time the publisher allegedly. And 6 months later, Rachel Carson came out with Silent Spring and swamped whatever readership I could have gained, although the book sold well, mainly among the scientific community, I may say, and less so among the public. Nobody could compete with Rachel's wonderful rhetoric, her poetry, her ability to arouse passions, and she had a following at least of 5 million readers, I'd say, to begin with. She did not make that by any means that wide-ranging critique that I did, and that was seen very clearly by writers like René Dubos, who were outstanding environmentalists in later years, and others who praised the book and seemed to think that it was more comprehensive than Rachel's book. But Rachel did a wonderful job, Rachel Carson in Silent Spring. She alerted people to the danger of pesticides. Her main focus was on birds, and her secondary focus was on human beings. But human beings, even if placed in a secondary focus, will be concerned about what they're going to use in the way of a spray if a mosquito comes into the house. And people were using sprays and lavishing, extolling chemistry all over the place. DuPont came out with its own slogan, for a better world, for better things and a better world through chemistry. They then dropped the word through chemistry, if I'm not mistaken. Years later, it became a dirty word. But this awareness, shall I say, the idea that we were not going to immediately face the kind of chronic crisis or have the kind of depression we had in the 1930s, that awareness, that need to broaden, go beyond the class analysis, which I had when the workers' movement was still very vibrant, the need to try to integrate ideas into a new form where we would learn, where at least I had learned from the experiences of highly centralized parties like the Communist Party, and for that matter even attempts to centralize like the Trotskyist parties, which still retain the centralistic tradition of the old Bolsheviks, and still further the experiences of the Russian Revolution and the wars that had taken place, that whole hectic period from 1917 up to 1945. That what was called, I think by Barrington Moore Jr., the 30 Years' War of the 20th century. So many millions of people were killed, and it seemed like anything could happen, both devastatingly and both optimistically, both pessimistically and optimistically. All of that led me to try to form an integrated view that I felt would lead to social changes without producing bureaucracies, such as, unfortunately, the Russian Revolution had done. It had produced bureaucracies. Not relying on one class, which incidentally was dwindling anyway, namely the industrial working class. Trying to raise broader issues that had vast cultural implications about the human spirit, about an ethical society. Foster a participatory democracy, to use the language of the 60s. Not just simply what is euphemistically called a representative democracy, an oxymoron, because you don't have the people ruling through representatives up there making decisions for them. A challenge Rousseau had made in the social contract 200 years earlier. That the people have to be in a face-to-face relationship to have a true democracy. Recognizing that both ecology and a very emancipatory vision of society required decentralization. I don't mean into little huts in the mountains, but I mean real, well-developed, clearly defined communities which could meet in face-to-face assemblies and then confederate. Instead of forming nation-states pyramidically, from a pyramidal viewpoint, running top to the top running the bottom, actually have a confederation, which I knew had existed in the past. And I was later to write a whole book about the history of confederations as distinguished from centralized nation-states and centralized parties. And thereby, working within these frameworks, I realized that the views I were advancing came more from an anarchist tradition than from a Marxist tradition. And I added on the word eco-anarchism, or at least somebody did for me, added on the word eco-anarchism, and speaking of what I believed, because I was now writing. I was writing pamphlet after pamphlet and book after book. And finally, calling for something more basic than just the abolition of classes and the abolition of exploitation, which were important to abolish. But I said, I wanted to argue it's important to abolish hierarchy, status, not just economic power, but also a kind of psycho-institutional power of status, hierarchy. In other words, rule, domination, not only exploitation. I raised the question in my own mind, it would be perfectly understandable that you could have a classless society and a non-exploitative society and have bureaucracies everywhere. And even if they didn't have material privileges, they had psychosocial privileges, self-esteem, call it whatever you like, that came from dominating people, even though, as in Plato's Republic, the guardians deny themselves everything, but they rule. They get out of the flesh pots, they live austere lives in the Republic, in Plato's Republic. They're the ones who think, who have very, shall we say, sparse diets, the Spartan way of living, but they rule. And that's what counts, you see. They rule. So that abolishing classes and abolishing exploitation, important as they are, were not enough. It was necessary to abolish domination and abolish the hierarchical structures that nourish domination. And that made me decide most assuredly that I wanted a form of ethical socialism or communism, free of domination, based on confederation, based on an ethics of complementarity in which people feel that they supplement each other instead of ruling each other on an famous order of 1 to 10. And that had I came into the 60s with that whole body of beliefs and tried very much as best I could. By that time I was already, I was a man in my 40s. I was well beyond you can't trust anyone over 30 years of age, but yet many young people did have some respect for my views. And so I started writing a series of works. One was called Ecology and Revolutionary Thought, saying that this is, in fact, the age of ecology, just as in the days of Galileo, in the days of the Renaissance, mechanics constituted the dominant social outlook. In the days of Darwin, biology, and specifically evolutionary theory, constituted the ideology of that period, at least in the sciences. And now, we were entering the age of ecology. I've since seen this recycled all over the place as though it had never been said before by people writing only a few years ago or only a decade or two ago. I emphasize that, and then I try to point out that the ecological crisis that capitalism was producing and that hierarchical society with its message of dominating nature, a message that even Marx accepted, stemmed really, and this is what I argued, from the domination of people. The ideology stemmed from that domination. In other words, the idea of dominating nature stemmed from the real domination of human by human. And that until we abolished the domination of human by human, not only the exploitation, but the domination, abolished not only classes but hierarchies, we would always have an ideology of dominating the natural world. And that if capitalism was permitted with that ideology and with its enormous technology, mainly a technology revolutionized by competition, by the marketplace, by grow or die, hence grow, 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 or else you die. I came to the conclusion that we had to eliminate hierarchy, domination, classes, exploitation, and we had to completely revise our whole view of what our place is in the natural world. What is our place in the natural world? That involved the whole body of ideas, stemming from a dialectical naturalism, as I call it, in which I saw human beings emerging out of nature, but potentially becoming nature self-conscious, aware of itself. So I spoke in terms of the human potential to, as it were, be a self-reflexive, self-conscious nature. And in the right society, finally playing a constructive role in the natural world as a force of nature, as well as in the social world as a kind of eco-social society, which would be in balance with nature. I described nature itself as the evolution of the natural world. I said, what does the word nature mean? A beautiful scene from a mountaintop? Heck. The back of a beautiful picture postcard? Nonsense. Nature is always being that is involved in becoming. And therefore, true nature in the biological sense, first nature, the nature from which we all emerged, is the evolution of life itself into ever greater complexity. A unity of diversity that led to ever greater complexity and offered an ever more subjective, not as yet intellectual or conscious, but an ever more subjective development of that all-important faculty of the ability to make choices. And then, out of that first nature, emerges social nature, or second nature. That is the realm where, even beginning with tribalism, the original ties are structured, social ties are structured around biological facts. They're structured around kinship, they're structured around gender. Those are the basic structures in early so-called primitive societies. They still are coming out of, as it were, the chrysalis, if you like, of the natural world. Age or blood, age ties, kinship, that is what defines your place in the community. Blood kinship ties, gender, whether you're a man or a woman, there's almost a division of the two cultures, but they complement each other. One is not, above the other. And the third one being the age relationship. Those are the three elements that early societies were formed around, and only with the emergence of cities do you begin to have territorialism instead of the blood tie, class instead of gender, and so on and so forth. So that you do have, in a sense, a kind of emergence out of the natural world, yet retaining ties. The family is still with us, kinship is still with us, age differences are still with us, gender differences are still with us, but they are reworked socially more and more and more. For the worse, in the form of patriarchy, for the worse, in the form of gerontocracies, where the elder rule the younger, and for the worse, in terms of kinship ties, namely nationalism, or the myth, the various myths of nationalism, which disturb me very much. So it was possible out of this kind of approach to evolve this anti-hierarchical approach and this whole notion of a first, second, and finally, ultimately, a third nature, which would be what we would call socialism, communism, use whatever word you like, with a small c and a small s. We would finally have free nature, namely products of nature called humanity, living in free societies, not only for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the whole biosphere. In other words, I saw nothing wrong with human beings intervening in nature, provided they intervened rationally, provided that they intervened creatively, provided that they intervened with sensitivity. Now, all of this, you see, is sort of percolating out of these, having exhausted, you know what I mean, a whole epoch going back to the French Revolution of the barricades, of the traditional oppressed, specifically the industrial working class, and working with notions of centralization, as we did way back in those days on the old left with ideas of centralized parties, which essentially really duplicated the state they were meant to overthrow. You see? Engaged in battles around industry. And now, going beyond that, I would like to think, in a vision, an eco-anarchist vision, or what I call social ecology more precisely. because I see that ecology is a meaningless discipline from a social point of view or from an environmental point of view unless you add the word social onto it. It depends upon the society in which we live that determines what we will do in the natural world. And if we have a society based on grow or die, we're going to destroy it, at least as we know the natural world in its present form, the biosphere as we know it today. Well, all of these ideas collect together into what I would like to think is a coherent point of view. I began at that point in the 60s, after finishing Ecology and Revolutionary Thought. Almost immediately I taught an ecological society in which at that time I explored every possibility, alternative possibility to the existing highly centralized technology and also highly destructive, ecologically destructive technology that we had. Taught a liberatory technology, advanced emphatically the notion of solar power, of wind power, of hydroelectric power, of geothermal energy, of all the different energy forms that we could possibly use that were non-polluting and non-destructive to the environment, which means I was also against big hydroelectric dams as well. Needless to say, in 1964, I was really, in a sense, moving out in the dark, out of the dark in this whole area, because none of this was being explored so far as I know. It was Schumacher who basically quoted my work. It was not I who quoted Schumacher's work. One has only to see the references to me and what's his work again? Small is Beautiful. And still others, all the way through. The ecology movement has now taken this for granted as though it came from the sky. But then the ecology movement did not really come into existence in a significant way until the 1970s. And the whole generation, in a sense, began to separate the 60s generation from the 70s generation. By the way, generational changes do not require 25 years. They can take place in 6 months. And I saw that as the new left began to unfold. I personally had gotten involved by that time. I'd become now more or less a full-time writer and lecturer. I personally got involved in the civil rights movement. East Side Corps, which incidentally, Mickey Schwerner, of the 3 civil rights workers who were killed in Mississippi in 1964, became involved with the civil rights movement. My hope always was that the civil rights movement would go beyond anything like black or white separatism. In fact, the demand of the civil rights movement in 1964 was for integration, not for segregation, and not for parochialism, in which the white and black and other people of color separate from each other. I can understand the need for people to discover their cultural identity. But you know, when we used to sing "We Shall Overcome," the opening verses were black and white together. They were not black and white apart. And Martin Luther King Jr., whatever my disagreements may have been about a whole bunch of tactics, nonetheless said, "He shall see the day when black and white, and Jew and Gentile," he could have added Muslim, "and men and women will all be together in in brotherhood or sisterhood or whatever you would like." I'm improvising now, but I recall the famous speech that he gave at the Lincoln Memorial in D.C. during the March on Washington. So my hope was that the civil rights movement would push toward an anti-hierarchical approach, not toward an anti-hierarchical, toward a universalistic approach. He says, Martin Luther King says, "I want all of humanity," he emphasizes the word all of humanity, "to enjoy the benefits of freedom." And that universalism appealed to my internationalism, which I had inherited way back in the days when I was still a Marxist. My hope was, additionally, that various other movements for gender liberation, specifically the feminist movement, would become anti-hierarchical. Not that it would become exclusive and say either that males are inferior, in the worst of cases, males are inferior to females, they don't have the sensibility that women have. I don't know if they do or they don't, and I don't know what kind of sensibilities may be involved. And in a future society, I don't know if we'll go beyond male or female sensibilities to a purely human sensibility. But that was my hope about the feminist movement. And in the ecology movement, I hoped it would become anti-hierarchical and anti-capitalist. That it would realize that there is an intimate relationship between the nature of the environment in which we live, the destruction that occurs when human beings intervened in this society and in the environment, and the amount of creation that could exist in what I would call a free nature, where human beings become self-conscious, rational, humanistic in the best sense, in the sense that as Homo sapiens sapiens, they are part of the continuity of evolution, however unique they may be. Well, we're now faced with a big crisis, I believe, in all of these views. And it pains me to think that if we don't try to recover a new movement, try to create a new left, go back to the old populist ideals of the Port Huron statement, however liberal they merely seem today to many radicals, although today, frankly, there are so few radicals around that the Port Huron statement seems like the Communist Manifesto. Statement seems to be more radical today than the Communist Manifesto. As radical as the Communist Manifesto, that is to say, stuff that was written in 1962, now seems inflammatorily radical. So, my hope was that a movement could congeal which would now, instead of becoming as one-sided as many movements are today that I once placed so much hope in, they would recover their all-sidedness. Therein lies the hope, so far as I am concerned, of a new left. Now, I don't like statements, I must say this right off the bat, that I'm neither not right nor left but forward. I find that whenever I hear that, for example, among the German Greens or the American Greens, and particularly certain green tendencies on the West Coast, which are bathed in mysticism, literally have turned ecology from a serious, radical calling, an attempt to wake up the world to a new left, go on to declare they do not want left nor right but forward. I find that most of them are not going forward, they're going backward. The retreat of many feminists, by no means all, but many feminists, into a mystical Starhawk type of witchcraft, with all its nuances about, the hidden goddess within me, whether it's within me or throughout the world, as though that is transcending religion, as though that is transcending dualism, when in point of fact, it is a new form of supernaturalism, with the hidden powers of women that I'm supposed to fear. I'm supposed to tremble before the hidden powers of women, any more than I think women should tremble before the so-called hidden powers of men. The idea, you know what I mean, that the white man is the enemy, as Farrakhan says, the white man? Since when is the white man one great big human giant? There are white men and women sleeping in the streets of New York who are impoverished. That is an enemy? Those people are enemies of mine? The white man, is that supposed to be the individual who runs corporations, or those who are dying of poor toxic chemicals and radioactive materials? That whole idea of the white man, which fails to recognize class differences, hierarchical differences among white people as well, who are victimized no less by this system than people of color, is, in my opinion, a reactionary form of parochialism. And then the white man was the universal enemy of all women? I can say in all honesty that to the best of my ability, and for a time I was even mystified by the idea that women were closer to nature than men. I no longer believe that, frankly. I wrote it, but now I would retract it, because I've seen how this has been exploited now. Exploited not to create a new movement, a new rationality, a new way of looking at the world, a new form of universalism, but quite to the contrary, to create a particularism of who is more feminist than thou, than me. Is it that black lesbians are more feminist than white lesbians? Is it that white lesbians are more feminist than heterosexual women who are black, or those who are white, or heterosexual men who are beyond all redemption? Are they all beyond redemption because they have testosterone? These are retreats back into an age, a really barbarous age, frankly. They scare me. These remind me of eras when patriarchalism was born. They remind me of the fetishization and, how shall I put it, the so-called spiritization of nature against rationality. They remind me of ways of thinking that oppose rational thinking and that are waking up, as it were, the various deities of the past to which human beings mindlessly sacrificed, whether they be Aztecs or they be Celts. Thousands of years ago, sacrificed human blood in order to nourish the cycles of nature. They remind me of an image of nature which is frightening, a somber, sinister form of nature that needs blood. They remind me of a period that whatever the failings of civilization, which have been enormous, and that have taken their toll in blood on an unbelievable scale, no question, and produced suffering that is horrible, have nonetheless also dialectically, like a double helix, had a progressive side, emancipating us from the kinship tie, emancipating us hopefully from gender forms of superiority, emancipating us from gerontocracies, and emancipating us from sinister forces, demonic forces that haunted the human imagination, that gave rise to the horrible witch trials, that gave rise to the terrifying wars of religious wars, crusades, that gave rise to the mass slaughter in which human history has been drenched as well. And to me, it is not that human beings are not civilized, it's that they're not civilized, that they're too civilized. That myth that prevails today among the deep ecology types, or some aspects of them, and other such eco-primitivists, they're all over the place, and mystics. It's not that human beings are too civilized, it's that they're not civilized enough. It's not that they are anthropocentric, but it's not that they are really humanistic. There's where the real faults lie, that we have not come in to the recognition of our own human potentialities, that we have not risen to the level of compassion, of understanding, of ethical behavior, that really would make for a new society and a new relationship, a rich relationship, a fecund, creative relationship with the natural world. And I come across people who believe that anytime you so much as a fish, you're interfering in the natural world. That if you engage in agriculture, there are idiots running around today who believe that all our sins come from agriculture. I don't want to mention their names. They write books on the fact that the moment we put a plow into the soil, we immediately began to despoil the natural world. That human beings should, frankly, be almost like the people who live on the Homeric island of the Lotus Eaters. I don't know if many people recall the Odyssey very much, but as Odysseus goes on his journey back to Ithaca from the Trojan Wars, he stops by one island where human beings sit around and eat the lotus. And the lotus makes them forget everything. They have no past, they have no future, they have no tomorrow, they have no yesterday. They have an eternal nowness, a world of eternal recurrence, where spring follows winter, and summer follows spring, and autumn follows summer, and winter finally, and back and back. And they know nothing. And there are people, literally, who all but want to reduce us to that state in the name of eco-primitivism or eco-mysticism, and sometimes in the form, I regret to say this, there are mystics in different national groups, in different ethnic groups, and in different gender groups who are cultivating this universal mysticism. And what concerns me today is, instead of having a social approach to the world, trying to put ecology in a social framework and try to put the future in a truly social framework, what is happening is that bit by bit, people are moving into a personalistic realm, semi-mystical realm, where they consult astrologers, fortune tellers. They're advertised over cable TV today. Fortune tellers. Very attractive ones to boot, you know. You don't know what kind of conversation you're going to get at the end of the phone, at the end of the 900 number, who'll tell you, do you want to know how to gamble? Do you want to know how to win at horses? Do you want to know who knows what? And people are consulting these people in the millions, perhaps. And people who are mystified completely by intergalactic dramas, you know, of a primitivism going back to the Mesozoic. Need I mention a certain movie which begins with J that is running throughout the country right now, and the dinosaur mania that goes with it, and the imagery, you know what I mean, of the beautiful affluent life we lived in the caves during the glacial and interglacial periods, where not a bone has been found that has ever been estimated to be more than 50 years of age. And with an idealization of primitivity, which is not to question the rich wealth of the sensibilities that one finds in Aboriginal peoples. Within the group, between the groups, forget it. Chronic warfare in most cases. But within the group, that sense of complementarity, the need to, you know, assure that the elderly and that the sick, or whatever you like, are carefully tended for. That sense of what I call usufruct and sharing, all commendable in Aboriginal communities, so-called primitive communities. But how can we take that? Can we return to that world again? Nothing is guaranteed to isolate the feminist movement, the ecology movement, and ethnic movements from their own society, from reaching people in the society. Then condemnations that agriculture is the source of all our sins, that we have to go back and worship pagan deities, which incidentally claimed a hell of a lot of blood and sacrifices, as I happen to know from my own studies of that era and of these practices in the past. I'm not making a defense here of Christianity. I beg you to understand that. I am an atheist, and I'll be very blunt about it. I do not believe, as an ecologist, I could not believe that there's a supernature, whether it be a goddess or a god, whether it be a woman with magnificent body or a man with a long beard, or whatever you may think he may be. But the idea basically of retreating into that kind of, frankly, isolated world where the persons all accounts, look inside yourself, discover your own creative power, so you peel away one aspect of civilization like an onion, and then you peel away another aspect and another aspect. You know, the whole idea that civilization, by the way, is responsible for everything else. If we only went back to our true nature, so like an onion, you peel away one layer and another layer and another layer, and guess what you'll find at the end? Nothing is left but the smell. Because we are all social beings. The most unique feature, one of the most unique features of what constitutes the human, is the fact that we go live through a protracted period of dependency on other people. We are among the most defenseless animals born. And we have a long period of development before we can begin to defend ourselves, find food. Without a community to support us, to first, in fact, literally take us out of the womb, because we are really so incomplete when we are born. We depend upon rich social ties to nourish us, to make us. We're not going to fight our way through the jungle with our nails, with our superior muscularity, with our enormous speed. By comparison with any other animal, we're almost a mess. But what we do have is the ability to grow, and grow subjectively, and grow intellectually. And with that, we need people around us. And so we are, above all, the most social beings that ever existed. If you want to get to the core of the onion, you're going to find that it isn't an onion anymore. in a sense. Well, it is all of this that has moved my writings to create a new kind of left, a new left. And this new left, in my opinion, must be a new form of politics. I've discussed essentially what are the pillars of my point of view, those things which underpin it. The rest of it is how is one to furnish that infrastructure of ideas, so to speak. The condemnation of hierarchy and domination as such, not only class and exploitation. The desire to create new forms of organization which are truly participatory in changing the world to produce a participatory democracy in society at large. The need to recognize the injuries of various status groups based on gender, based on ethnicity, based on age, based on a whole bunch of differentiations which cannot be simply explained in class analyses, of a traditional economistic sort. But the importance, at the same time, of creating a sense of universality and a new kind of rationality, which I would call dialectic. It doesn't have to be the one-to-one linear rationality, A equals A, period. But rather that things are always in a state of becoming, in a state of flux, becoming whole, enriched, assuming that the development is rational. If it's irrational, it can fall apart. Fragmentation is just as possible as integration. Those things are real. This is a kind of basic infrastructure, along with the idea that we have to achieve a new third nature, if you like, or free nature, by which I mean a truly collectivistic society in which people live in cooperation with each other and with the realities of the natural environment, including other life forms. Would you believe that I'm called anthropocentric for daring to suggest this? As though the only choices are either biocentric, so you have to say that human beings are no different than squirrels, at least in terms of their intrinsic worth, as biocentricity, or that I want to grab the whole earth for nothing but human beings and say that they are the king of all beasts. The supposition, incidentally, being that if human beings can think, they therefore have to command. Notice the thinking that goes on in these so-called deep ecology, mystical ecology, egalitarian notions. Suppose I were to say human beings are superior. Does it mean that they have to destroy everything around them? Does it mean that they have to be unfeeling? That they have to be uncaring? I just wonder at the way people think these issues out, you see. But now, I submit to you, we need a new politics now. And by a new politics, I don't simply mean the formation of more food co-ops, which tend to get either co-opted, or else, become that is to say, they become an outright business, or else they fall apart. You have only to look at the career of Ben and Jerry's in Burlington, in Vermont, where I saw these two kids, churning out ice cream, and are now a huge multinational. And have been, fined, as you may well know, or as people may well know who live in Vermont, of being serious polluters at various times. All, to get one to eat these nice enriched pops, which I personally would regard as walking, a heart attacks on a stick. So this new green eco-capitalism, turns me off. Are we going to go back to a green politics like the German Greens, which have now become such a completely stultified party that they're willing to work with the Christian Democrats, that is to say, the equivalent of the Reaganites in Germany, in order to get into higher office, and have been even repudiated by the Social Democrats, who say the Germans want jobs, they don't want to hear about the environment, we don't want to have anything to do with the Greens. Most people don't know that in the United States today. Do I want to become the equivalent of a left-wing Democratic Party person by calling myself a democratic socialist? I have only to read a number of articles by people who, well-meaning as they are essentially inviting us to establish market socialism. How do you like that for an oxymoron? Market socialism. Now, my argument is that we've got to get away, as millions of people in fact want to get away, from the whole party-type structure, the whole bureaucratic structure, and not simply organize co-ops and various types of communes, but very importantly, get into the public arena on the municipal level, on the local level, and actually run for city council with a view toward trying to establish and foment a feeling in favor of popular assemblies. Here in Burlington, Vermont, we have potentially, as a result of activities that I've been deeply involved in, 5 neighborhood assemblies. And in Vermont, we've had town meetings. The question is to vitalize them and to multiply them and to proliferate them in all the cities, towns, and villages of the United States. If one tells me that there are 8 million people in New York City, I agree. How are you going to have a town meeting there? I'll leave Ross Perot out of the situation, as you doubtless know. I believe in a face-to-face democracy. You break them up. You go ahead and you form them in all the different neighborhoods and all the different blocks if necessary, and then coordinate them through confederations in which delegates are simply mandated and could be recalled at the drop of a hat. And then people will, if there are people who still believe in decentralizing the society, and this is supposed to be a canon of ecological thinking, why is my view so absurd in their eyes? Now, my argument is that there are different ways in which we can now establish, by using even the city councils that we have, to relocalize power, decenter, as you'd like it, power into viable community groups that can be linked together through confederations, whether they are inside giant cities or whether they consist of small towns interlocked with each other in a genuinely democratic basis. And that confederalism, which has been thousands of years old and has always competed with the nation state, has as much vitality today as it had hundreds of years ago, be it in the town meetings of New England, as it had thousands of years ago, going back as far as Sumeria and ancient Greece. And I know what's wrong with all the old societies. I'm not trying to fall back on any past. I'm trying to take what are characteristics of earlier societies and use them in a new and integrated way for a future society. A society which is truly self-conscious and ecological and free of hierarchy and domination. And this is a very important issue for me. Has the breakdown of the Berlin Wall, has the Yeltsin experience doomed the idea of a cooperative society forever? Because Stalin perverted the ideals of socialism. Because Gorbachev did this or that. Because Yeltsin wants to restore private property, obviously in the interest of a very distinct mafioso class in Russia today. Does Clinton, hobnobbing with the big industrialists as he did with the auto manufacturers, want to give us NAFTA, which will be a super empire imposed on everything else, a state on top of all the other states? Does this doom the ideal of human cooperation, of living together, of sharing with other life forms as well as ourselves, the planet in a creative, constructive way? Are we now to write off the possibility of culture and have a new TV kind of network, highway, whatever they call it? Is that going to replace human culture now? Does that end Shakespeare, Beethoven, Bach? Civilization to be written off, and the idea of living in a cooperative society can't be canceled out by thugs, be they Yeltsin, Gorbachev, and frankly, in my opinion, many of the people who are floating around the Clinton administration, including its most distinguished figures. If that ideal is gone, indeed, it'll be neither right nor left. It'll be right. And not only that, it'll be dragging us backward into an age of human anti-rationality, of human mysticism, of manipulation by the mass media, of engineering public consent, of reducing people, frankly, to zombies in which life has no meaning. You're going to die anyway, you know. At least live with nobility. And if there's nothing more noble before us than a regime based on private property, based on egotism, called free enterprise. I love that word, free enterprise. Rugged individualism. Oh, it's so rugged. Call it egotism, and then you got the right name. Free trade. Or sleazy compromises like market socialism. Okay? Totalitarian democracy. And think of other such oxymorons and put up a good fight. But there is still a possibility, and that possibility is to recreate a new politics. One built around a truly participatory democracy, if we mean it. One built around municipal control of the economy. It doesn't have to be workers' control, because when workers take control, in most cases they establish working-class capitalism. That happened everywhere, by the way. I have a long story on that one. It doesn't have to be nationalized property. That simply builds up the nation state. That's what it did in Russia. It doesn't have to be anything as simple as citizens coming together, no longer thinking in terms of their occupational interests, because there's no point in thinking about it. And not to fear technology, but to use it to free people from labor so that they can do work rather than labor, creative work, be it writing, be it poetry, be it music, or be it craftspersonship and everything like that. Why do we have to be afraid of technology and suddenly develop this anti-technological bent? And why do we have to use euphemisms? When we talk of industrial society, what are we really talking about? We're talking of capitalism, which existed before the Industrial Revolution and did a lot of harm. So when we talk about industrial society, we talk about autonomous technology. We've been using technology from the moment we became human beings, as far back as you can go. Forests were burned down thousands and thousands of years ago by hunter-gatherers, or foragers as they're called. There is hardly a single so-called original forest left in the world anywhere, as anthropologists have been discovering quite recently. Even the so-called, quotes, virgin forest of the Amazon was known to have been covered by towns, communities, tribes, who, by the way, cleared a great deal of the forest. Much of it is regrown in second growth or third growth, or whatever you like. So the whole mythology that is growing up today about a pure nature and about a civilization that has poisoned our beautiful, beautiful souls, and as though we can live outside society and keep peeling the onion until we have nothing but the scent left, and then we're going to reject both right and left, as though the right isn't around right now. It's all over the place. Forgive me. It's the left that isn't around right now. And then go backward into mysticism, while at the same time science is rushing ahead and engineering is rushing ahead in a maddening, blind, technological, ongoing, there's no such thing as an industrial revolution anymore. You have ongoing industrial revolutions, if revolutions you even want to call them anymore, with a knowledge of the secrets of life in terms of, biogenetics, bioengineering, and knowledge of the very secrets of the material world in the form of nuclear energy. Can you imagine, with highways, communication highways and networks, and the discussions with equipment so sensitive that what we are talking about right here in this room, can be heard 20 feet away. Not to speak of cameras that can take pictures of you smoking on a street corner, thousands and thousands of feet up in the air. There are rich opportunities and there are devastating dangers that lie before us today. And the only solution to them ultimately is what we will do. And what we will do depends upon whether or not we can become a we instead of hierarchies and classes, basically in tension with each other or at war with each other, and each feeling that it has to command another. Those are the views that now compete with each other, either a truly participatory democracy based on the municipalization of property, structured around confederations which are based in turn on face-to-face democracy, so that people are not considered idiots, but everyone is considered to be competent to run or manage a given society, or the idiocy of totalitarianism, in which everyone is regarded as an infant, must have a brilliant representative like Ronald Reagan to run the world for them, or George Bush, okay, or the Clintons, okay, and giant industrial political institutions that are based above all on market and market competition and rule and exploitation, at which point the planet will go down. Those choices now face us as we move into the 21st century, and we must face them realistically and stop making up myths about what either this one or that one thinks, that I am anthropocentric and that somebody else is this or that or that or that or fascistic, and start facing the realities of the situation and weigh them seriously.
In Michael Parenti's recent book, Land of Idols, he's discussing left-righters and their fervent anti-Marxist tendencies. And because of those anti-Marxist tendencies, he says they refuse to discuss class. And he quotes you from a lecture at Brown University, given, as he says, years ago, saying that there are no classes, only people. I was wondering if you could respond to Parenti's quote.
I find that almost laughable, unbelievably laughable, since I've been accused by my opponents on the right, so to speak. And I say so to speak because I'm not too sure sometimes whether Parenti's on the right or on the left, depending upon one's vision of socialism and communism. But I've been accused by people overtly on the left, on the right, of being class-conscious, class-oriented, and anti-capitalist. After all that I've had to say, and all that I have written about capitalist society, how it can be assumed for one moment that I don't think there is a class society, is beyond my imagination and only possible, I suspect, in the bizarre world of Michael Parenti, whom I've known in the past. Michael, I think, is a nice, feisty, third period type Stalinoid, if I may say that, and I don't know why you should be ashamed of it. But if not, one thing I can say with all certainty is that Michael once, and I don't want to trade accusations, put his hand up in a speech to the lecture I was giving in Hampshire College, quotes a few years ago, heard by at least 200 to 250 people who may be able to verify it, and identified himself as an anarcho-communist. I need only say that for me to talk about capitalist society and the need to dissolve it and to say that there is a right, unfortunately, I don't think Michael Parenti would be representative of what I would call a viable left, that the statement is heard with Michael Parenti's selective way of hearing things. So let me put it bluntly, if he really believes that, he's a liar. At least he's lying to himself. I find it absurd, to have to deal with these kind of accusations. But what I do find very interesting is that he also speaks of me as part of an anti-communist left. Now, this is absolutely delicious. I don't know what anarcho-communism, what Michael Parenti thinks anarcho-communism is. But having clearly identified myself and been identified as an anarcho-communist, or call it anything you like, a libertarian communist. The word libertarian, by the way, was made up by anarchists in France back in the 1890s and has been picked up by proprietarians who use the word libertarian to signify their pure capitalist beliefs.
Bill Buckley, for example.
Yes. well, even Ronald Reagan said, I sort of think you'd call me a libertarian. It was actually, the word was made up in 1890 in France by Élisée Reclus, who was one of Michael Bakunin's closest associates, because the word anarchist, used in France in the 1890s as a result of terrorist attacks, was declared virtually illegal. So they had to find another word for it. Since then, it's been mutating its way into the right wing for the most preposterous, on the most preposterous bases. But very significantly, to go back to what I was trying to say, is that Parenti identifies my opposition to his Stalinoid type of views as being anti-communist. I find that intriguing. I find that a very totalitarian way of characterizing other people's ideas. And that's what I really want to turn to. And this is not an ad hominem criticism. Just as the Stalinists in the 1930s, who had totally betrayed the revolution, of course, without knowing it in some cases as rank and file, and consciously knowing it in the case of Stalin, Molotov, and the rest of his gang, called everyone who opposed them a fascist, or at least people on the left who opposed them as fascist. I find it very disturbing that a Parenti, one Michael Parenti, can call people who disagree with his, in my opinion, very totalitarian view of communism as anti-communist. I mean, this is, if you don't mind my saying this, a kind of rather disturbing inversion. And I've encountered this all over the place, by the way, in other respects. I've criticized people like Ed Abbey and certain members, leaders of Earth First, as being anti-Earth First, number one, because I criticized them, not Earth First. And secondly, and this has been repeated even in academic periodicals, that I called Earth First eco-fascist. Whereas in point of fact, I talked about the dangers of eco-fascism as a result of certain statements made by people like Edward Abbey, who declared, one, that the United States is a Northern European culture, read Aryan, that Hebrew superstitions are responsible for the ecological crisis ideologically, read anti-Semite, okay, that three, Mexicans should be shoved back across the border, okay, and continual racist remarks, and, by the way, misogynist remarks, addressing me, incidentally, as a, quotes, fat old woman, if that's the worst possible thing I could be if I were one. You know, his major epithet. Now, when I designated him as an eco-fascist or potential eco-fascist, you must understand that, like Parenti, these totalitarian types, no matter what they call themselves, or libertarian types, to use a true, what is now becoming current, although grossly distorted, right-wing language, these really totalitarian types, in the way they argue, distorted everything I had to say and claimed that I was accusing Earth First, a movement that I, in fact, supported as best I could, you see, and with whose ideas I in great part agreed with, provided they didn't get messed up with this whole idea that people are a cancer on the planet, which is what some of their leaders or founders said. They accused me of accusing Earth First and accusing deep ecology of being eco-fascist. This is the way I did. And by the way, the people who made these accusations, you know, the other flip side of Parenti's coin, those people who made these accusations against me were university professors. They were university professors, and they were writing in the literature, the exotic academic literature on environmental science, environmental politics, whatever you like. So what shocks me more than Parenti's very selective way of hearing what I had to say, I who have been condemning capitalism, and hence presumably managed somehow not to believe in a class society, this selective way of hearing is not simply a feature of an alleged militant, a neo-Bolshevik like Parenti, who, by the way, even a Lenin would be ashamed of, considering some of his crudities. I find that to be a very common phenomenon today. as part of the complete cultural degradation and moral degradation of discourse today. And if I seem heated about it, it's because I'm deeply concerned about the ethical probity of what would be a left-wing movement. If to disagree with Parenti's version of communism is to be anti-communist, I find that to be a purely arrogant remark, even if I were to say that there are no classes and only people, which is an absurd statement in the first place. I never said any such statement. I talked about the idea that ultimately we must appeal to humanity as a whole and not simply to the working class. And this is the way it comes out, mutated through that computer that calls itself Michael Parenti.
I would like to go...
Do you like that answer or you don't? There's a generalization that has to be drawn there.
Sure. I would like to go back to the beginning of your discussion. Two events in history that had a profound impact on you and on history. One that's received enormous coverage, one that has been somewhat forgotten. The Bolshevik Revolution and the Spanish Revolution. Two questions. Why is the Bolshevik Revolution given such coverage as compared to the Spanish Revolution? And then to compare and contrast the two. As I see the Bolshevik Revolution, they in part destroyed the anarchist movements in Russia at the time. Yes?
Well, of course, yes, they did destroy the anarchist movement. Although there are strange stories about this thing that have never been clarified, and I believe in truth above any other tactical or polemical goal. The Russian Revolution obviously received the greatest amount of attention because, first of all, it occurred on the eve of what seemed like world revolutions. October, to use the old Russian date, or November, to use our contemporary American dates and way of dating, and perhaps even, for that matter, the Russian today. October 1917 shook the whole world. It was 10 days, as John Reed so dramatically put it, that shook the whole world. Nobody quite knew what the Bolsheviks were up to. Nobody knew who Lenin was. When finally red flags began to replace the traditional Russian Republican flag, not to speak of the Tsarist one, when at length Lenin and the Bolsheviks made appeals to all the workers of the world to turn the imperialist war into a civil war, when in fact one of the most extraordinary propaganda machines, so much in contrast, by the way, to Stalin, made an appeal to all the oppressed to rise up. The Russian Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution more precisely, was indeed a threat to world capitalism. Engaged in the midst of a war that was yet to continue for a full year after the Bolsheviks took power, it must be seen that the Russian Revolution was indeed a threat to world capitalism. It might have easily gotten out of the control of the Bolsheviks had revolutions occurred elsewhere in Europe. Thus had Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht succeeded in January of 1919 in turning Germany into a Soviet republic, and Luxemburg's ideas were extremely libertarian, by the way. There's a whole gray zone in which it's not at all clear where the anarchist called Luxemburg comes to an end and the Marxist called Luxemburg begins. And had Gustav Landauer and the people around him, or the people whom he worked with, established a solid Bavarian Soviet republic, and many of them were anarchists. Landauer himself was at least very closely akin to the anarchists and left the Second International, the Socialist International, because they refused to accept anarchists. The Russian Revolution might have easily gotten out of the control of Lenin, whatever his ideas may have been, and moved into a much more, and I use this in a leftist sense, libertarian revolution. The second thing that reinforced the Bolshevik Revolution in terms of its popularity and the amount of knowledge and study, whole institutes and libraries in I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of volumes exist just in English alone, for all I know, about the Bolshevik Revolution, is the fact that they established a power, a nation state, and they called it the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And it took years for the bourgeoisie, note well that I'm speaking in class terms here, it took years for the bourgeoisie to acclimate itself to the idea that Stalin was not a revolutionist, that the expulsion of Trotsky marked the and Bukharin later on, about a year or so later, marked the end of the Russian Revolution, even in Bolshevik terms, that the Bolsheviks themselves were eliminated by Stalin, and Stalinism, and in its current form, Stalinoidism, because you have these new mutations of Stalin, who denounce him at the same time that they essentially work with his tactics and techniques, were recognized by the world bourgeoisie as perfectly harmless to capitalism, at least to world capitalism. Thus, Russia was invited to join the League of Nations, which Lenin denounced. And thus, Stalin went ahead and not only joined the League of Nations, but simply sold all the communist parties of the world to their respect, with the exception of Asia perhaps, to their respective capitalist classes, with the one difference and caveat that whenever Russia needed them for other purposes, they were used for other purposes. The Spanish Revolution remained a total secret. So much so that a United Press reporter, who in no sense of the word could be called an anarchist, wrote a book called The Grand Camouflage. He was a UP reporter, United Press reporter. He had been stationed in Madrid, and the revolution accidentally broke out under his nose, you see, as a correspondent. And he had a deep intrinsic honesty about him, even though he was in no way sympathetic to the left, okay? Nor can I say for the right, I don't know, but I know he was not sympathetic toward the left. And I talked to him before he died over the telephone for over 3 hours or 2 hours, because I was preparing for another volume on Spain. He provocatively put in the remark, and I just wish I had this book right before me, but I'll try to give you the best rendition my memory allows, that the Spanish Revolution was in many respects much deeper than the Bolshevik Revolution, and has, what amounts to a conspiracy of silence, been concealed in its full scope from the general public. And the implication, as I remember, for me it's not an implication, it's a fact, was that American liberals were working hand in glove with the American Stalinists, because the Soviet Union, as they called it then, was supposed to be in the vanguard of the fight against Hitler's Nazism. And we all know what the consequences were. By late August or early September, Stalin signed the pact, or Molotov in his name signed the pact with Ribbentrop in the name of Hitler, and the two went into a waltz together for about a year and a half or so, practically 2 years. So the Spanish Revolution was essentially suppressed. The liberals suppressed it. The Stalinists, needless to say, didn't even say there was a revolution. They called it a war against fascism. And they didn't call the government, the Republican government, They called everybody who was fighting against Franco, they called them loyalists. That was the most widely used term during the Spanish Revolution of 1936-37. After 37, it began to go downhill and turned from a revolution into a mere military civil war. And this was done with extraordinary success, so much so that many writers who were trying to tell the truth at that time had their books suppressed. It was not until during and after the war, and first in Britain and only later in the United States, that the truth about what happened in Spain could come out. So that would be my explanation for what happened. I mean, why it is that one is well known and the other has been buried in virtual obscurity.
You were talking about capitalism and comparing capitalism in the 1920s and 30s to capitalism today. Could you give some analysis of those differences?
Well, I think it's one of the most important questions that could be asked. We all know that there are great changes in the structure of the capitalist economy. We have more than enough parentheses around to tell us about that, and many of their analyses at times are good. Okay, and Harry Magdoff has pointed things out, and Braverman in Monthly Review, and Sweezy, the entire group of self-styled Marxist economists, although I don't know what they would call themselves or who's alive right now, today. But I'd like to talk of one aspect that I think is particularly important. In the 1930s, capitalism was surely a dominant economy. That is to say, in the factories, in the factories and transportation and mining, and to a growing extent clearly in agriculture, in such ordinary little shops that my parents worked in, notably in the garment district in New York. You had a form of capitalism that was more personified and, very importantly, economically together, so to speak. But it was above all an economy. After you went into that economy and worked during the day, if you were a worker at that time, you came back home to a very different world. You had, within the economic sphere, you had capitalism. But within your neighborhood or within your town, village, you came back to a different world entirely. You still had the old-style families, presumably patriarchal, although in many cases, as I know in my family, women played a decisive role in the home. If they were locked into the home, they were also locked out of capitalism. And there you had at least 3 generations. That was my experience. And my family was relatively unstable by comparison with others. You had your grandmother, as I did, living with you. You had your parents. And then there were people who were your peers or siblings. So you went from a highly industrialized or relatively industrialized world while you were working back to a pre-capitalist world. And this pre-capitalist world could have very well have existed 200 years ago or 300 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution. You had markets, family, you know what I mean, family shops, in which people lived, by the way, in the back of the store. They had their apartments there, that sold you your vegetables and your fruit. And then you went to another shop, much the same like the vegetable and fruit store, and you went to the butcher, and there you bought only meat. And then you went to the poultry store, and there you bought only poultry. And then you went to the fish store, and you bought only fish. And you went to the bakery. And on and on and on it went. And you had workers sitting there, actually handicraft workers, making cigars in the window. It used to enchant us as kids. But there they were, making these cigars in the window, rolling up leaves. And they used to play tricks with us, you know, to amuse us, to show how deft and skillful they were. And they chortled with each other as we watched them. And you could go in and buy a suit, and it would be tailor-made. The tailor would buy all the cloth that he needed, and then measure you, and then make the suit for you. And many other clothing articles were exactly bought that way. And you had hat stores and shoe stores, and I can go on and on and on. And cobblers could even make shoes for you. Now that was a world that could have existed in the 12th century, you know what I'm saying? And you played in a neighborhood that was very much intact as a community, even in New York City. As I told you, New York in my day, as a youth and as a child, was made up of 1,000 villages. And they had all the smells and odors and feeling of an old world. And people thought not in the exact analyses of, surplus value and labor theory of value. They thought in terms of the rich and the poor. That's the way they saw it. They saw themselves as workers, and they saw the others as capitalists. But the word capitalist was interchangeable with rich. And the word worker was interchangeable with poor. Or they had exploiters and exploited. And very commonly used word at that time was toilers. You know, not just workers, and not just poor, and not just exploited, but toilers. T-O-I-L-E-R-S. A word that's virtually disappeared from our vocabulary. And people were intensely class conscious of that. They were intensely class conscious of the fact that even if they were well off, they were exploited. That they knew. They knew who was the boss and who was not. And they knew that a marked distinction existed between the two, which appeared not only in behavior patterns, but even in the way one wore clothing. One wore snap caps if one was a worker. You've seen them in movies like The Sting, you know? And usually pulled down jauntily on a side. One wore leather jackets, sheepskin, In those days, they were very inexpensive. Now I take it they're very exotic and high-priced. You wore high shoes when I was young, you know, what you'd call work shoes. I don't know what you'd call them today any longer. And you had a different way of walking, of addressing. And you were very plainly not among the wealthy. That was clear. And you had that sense of solidarity, an intense sense of solidarity. First of all, most of the people I knew, despite the fact that they came from European countries with distinctive languages different from that of other Americans in many cases, different from that of even other immigrants. You had a little Israel, if you want to call it that. You had a little Italy, if you want to call it that. You had a little Ireland, if you want to call it that. You even had white Anglo-Saxon areas that were questionable. They were poor whites. You see what I'm saying? And it was an intense sense of solidarity, which I remember. And I loved it. When Sacco and Vanzetti were electrocuted, and I was a kid at that point, I was awakened, and my grandmother cried out to me, and I'll never forget this memory. It's 1926, 27, I'm 5, 6 years old, but there are things that stick in your mind. And my grandmother waved the newspaper in front of me, because they had, if my memory is correct, sketches of them both in the electric chair. They were not photographs, but sketches. They seem to have had the capacity to run off 2 editions. If they were not electrocuted, they had one headline. If they were electrocuted, they had another. That is, if they were pardoned or their electrocution was deferred. Although it was almost certain by then that they were going to be electrocuted. And they had kids running around, extra, extra, Sacco and Vanzetti electrocuted, and all the lights in the neighborhood went on. And everybody came out. And this was a Jewish neighborhood, and those were 2 Italian anarchists. And people were weeping. And my grandmother's tears were running down her eyes, and my mother's tears were running down her eyes. And this, my grandmother said to me, is what they do to 2 ordinary workers. Remember that. This is what they do to ordinary workers, 2 Italian workers. That sense of solidarity was immense. So you had this tension, very powerful tension, between an old world, pre-industrial, and at the same time intensely class conscious, and an industrial world that was only part of your life. It was not your life. So capitalism did not penetrate into society. It did not become an everyday form of life. What happened has happened since the end of the Second World War, through the 50s and into the 60s and 70s, and especially now, is that capitalism has turned from a capitalist market into a capitalist society. Now, people think as though they were in the market, as though they were involved in business. They invest in their marriages. They invest in their children. Listen to the language carefully. What's the bottom line of the balance sheet? You understand? The bottom line. I hear that all the time. And whenever people talk to me that way, I say, well, as Henry Fonda did in a movie called Golden Pond, his last one, so you're a bottom line guy, sort of thing. But I had been protesting against that language all the time. And what's in it for me? What's in it for me? I mean, the whole enchantment, if I may use a word that I ordinarily dislike, of that pre-capitalist world has disappeared and it's been absorbed totally into the industrial and business world. And what's more important to me, and this frightens the heck out of me, is that it's getting into the mind. It literally forms concepts that are being implanted in the way in which, in the mind, in such a way that people think now that way. What's in it for me? Marriage has been a bad investment. You know what I mean? I got to invest in my children and so on and so forth. And with that comes the electronic language, like input, output, feedback instead of dialogue, you know? And that disquiets me enormously. And what I fear more importantly than anything else is that we are losing a sense of contrast. We're losing a sense of contrast between capitalism as being something really irrational, capitalism as being something really, in a sense, unique. It hasn't existed since the beginning of time. That sense that there is another world that challenges capitalism, be it in the home, be it in the neighborhood, be it on street corner meetings, be it in ordinary discourse, and today, to think in bourgeois terms all the time, as though capitalism has always existed from the very beginning of glaciation of the planet. And that is very frightening today. And these changes have, in a sense, blurred the tensions that really exist in the present society. They really blurred the tensions that exist in the present society, with the result, very unfortunately, that people now can talk about anti-communist leftists without knowing, as Parenti has, without knowing what they're talking about. And people can go around calling others fascists without knowing what the word means. And a good many other terms that are now being thrown around without a real sense of the tensions that really exist underneath, and that these words are supposed to explicate rather than cover up. And that troubles me. I urge people not to think in those terms, to use the word investment, the bottom line, what's your input, what's your output. You know, that language, and I'm only scratching the surface of a whole vocabulary, a whole dictionary, is very frightening because it gets people to conceptualize within the framework of the system. Within the framework of the system. So these distinctions must be made, and they are relatively new. They really got underway with Eisenhower. Not that Eisenhower is personally responsible, he represents an era. It was at that particular point that a whole spectrum of cultural features and a whole vocabulary began to come into use more and more and more. Many people do not know that input, output, and feedback is the language of the Second World War, namely of radar. People wouldn't have known what you're talking about if you said input, output, or feedback, unless you were a physicist or an electronics engineer. Then afterward, later on, it got out into the public as a whole. And the bottom line, this word makes me shudder. Is life a balance sheet? And these things are very, very frightening. And I'm very eager to make people aware of that. They never use that language if I have anything to say about it when they talk to me. I say, I don't know what you're talking about.
Bakunin said that the two most precious human qualities, the power to reason and the power to rebel. Seems that in the intellectual set these days, rebellion has turned to texts, something called postmodernism, which, as far as I can tell, has little to do with reason. It's highly irrational. What's your take on postmodernism?
It's a widely disparate phenomenon, first of all. There's no one single body of ideas, or text, if you like, that is the last word in postmodernism, just like there's no single word, text, that is the text that is communism, you know. Marx had his version, Kropotkin had his version, and there were many others who had their version, long before Marx and Kropotkin. But postmodernism, in my opinion, if you try to put it together as an ensemble, is marked by certain features. And I think one of the most misleading things, I suspect in any case, one of the most misleading things I encounter about discussions around postmodernism is an attempt to try to root it in something other than the '68 events. And there's a reason why I have to say that. Prior to the '68 events in France, the famous May-June uprising of the students, in which some 11 to 14 million workers went out on general strike for a period of at least 2 months, the word modernity and any references that was not strictly relevant to the word modernity generally meant the Enlightenment. And there's an attempt to obscure that, because the Enlightenment in the 18th century, which had many defects, was nonetheless a tremendous project in a sense of civilizing humanity and making it aware, first of all, of the importance of reason, a word that is arguable, because there's different kinds of rationality. You can have analytical rationality of the kind that you get in courses in logic today, 101. And you can have dialectical rationality, again, which can either be materialist, dialectical materialism, which Engels claimed it was, or you can have dialectical idealism, which more or less Hegel claimed it was, or you can have dialectical naturalism, which I would argue for. These are separate questions. But along with the project of the Enlightenment, there was always a stream that was very, very dubious. very strange. In reaction to the Industrial Revolution, and the Enlightenment favored technological development, and even the conquest of nature, a terminology I don't even use as such. I think it's only an idea. I don't think you can conquer nature any more than you can conquer a water molecule. It's kind of ridiculous. So, but in any case, the idea of technological development, the idea of a rational society, however that was spelt out, it could have been spelt out purely in political terms, liberty, equality, and fraternity, or it could have been spelled out as Marx and even the anarchists tried to spell it out, in communist terms, from each according to his, her ability to each according to his, her needs. But the point nonetheless remains that the idea of a rational society guided by reason, again, arguably, what we mean by reason, is a separate question. And the idea of human emancipation, in the case of the French Revolution and the French Enlightenment, before the law, you know, justice is blind and does not see distinctions between class, color, gender, and the like, those ideals were permanent ideals. That is to say, they scored a great advance over the idea that people are innately inferior and must obey their superiors, which was the pre-Enlightenment mentality, that the peasant must remove his or her hat before the Lord and follow the Lord's orders, or even earlier than that, slaves and slave masters. So that Enlightenment project is a glorious project for all its historically limited errors and flaws, and understandable within a historical context. And that context is very, very important to understand how, in different periods, people freed themselves in varying degrees, in spite of all the monstrosities that had coexisted and intertwined freedom with domination. And that's a point that I've always played against each other, the legacy of freedom and the legacy of domination, like a double helix. Still, that was a tremendous gain. And moving along with it, as part of the double helix, was the famous Romantic movement, which rejected technology, which revered the Middle Ages, by the way. Don't forget that Sir Walter Scott was one of the voices of that anti-Enlightenment and that Romantic movement. Walter Scott's Ivanhoe and other such stories mystify and recreate the image of medievalism. And along with that came various forms of aesthetic vanguardism, which had a quasi-mystical character. The power of words, in a sense, to hypnotize, and even hypnotize people and even make history. And with it, a denial of any kind of progress whatever. Which is not to say that I'm going around saying that there always was progress. By far, I am not. And I don't want anyone to come around and say I'm a pro-progressive lefty. It has been a mixed situation. And the question is, when will society resolve the legacy of freedom such that it becomes the prevailing system, or the legacy of domination when it becomes the prevailing system, as it did, for example, for a while under Hitler in the Third Reich, or Stalin in Russia. Postmodernism tried to find its traditions in this quasi-ambivalent Romantic movement, largely mystical, anti-rational, anti-technological, anti-anything, and anti-history. Okay? And while it is possible in architecture and in city planning and in certain texts to decipher them in such a way that they seem to be part of the Romantic tradition going as far back as the French Revolution, as far back as Rousseau. Okay? The real postmodernist floodgates were opened up after 1968. And I'll tell you why, because I was in Paris at that time. The Stalinists proved to be total collaborators for all practical purposes of Charles de Gaulle. They were against the 68 uprising. I can go into great detail about that. It's a story that has yet to be fully told to people today, who are separated by it by a distance of the greater part of, 25 or 30 years practically. But what happened was that a lot of people who were Marxists of one sort or another, note well, were so shocked by the behavior of the communists and by the queasiness of the socialists, and by the way in which the communist trade union, the CGT, the General Confederation of Labor, tried to keep the students separated from the workers and tried to control the workers and bring them back to work and turn it into a purely economic general strike, which the workers initially rejected. They refused the contract. That a lot of former Marxists, I think of people from the Socialism or Barbarism group in France, which had dissolved by that time but still had its people floating around, like Baudrillard. Okay? I think of even Marxists like Foucault at one particular point in his life. I think of, who are my favorite? Lyotard. Now, I'm identifying people particularly because they were associated with dissident Marxist groups who were so revolted by the behavior of the communists that they decided to go into total 180-degree reverse. It isn't that they became anti-communist. It's, in a sense, much more deep-seated. They denied the very existence of history. They denied that history had any meaning whatever, that you could sort out progressive from regressive or whatever you like, that even such words like that were arguable. They went ahead and they proceeded to deny rationality as such. Now, mind you, every one of them modifies these denials, okay? So that, as I told you, you can no more pick out the ultimate postmodern text any more than you can pick out the ultimate communist text. You can only talk of variations, each on the other. They denied, therefore, history. They denied rationality. They engaged in this. I don't even want to go into the whole question of deconstruction because it has a very sinister meaning in some respects that I don't care to get into. And they hypothesized spontaneity and came out completely against political activity. So they, in other words, for every yay that the communists said, they said an absolute nay. And even when the communists said something, at least if only because of tradition, that was true, you know, it came from a Marxist text, they said it was untrue. And thus, the result was that they continually dissolved history, the individual, the author, everything into what, in my opinion, is nihilism. Now, you can play games with that nihilism, as Foucault basically really did. Ultimately, Foucault, after going through at least 2 phases of his development, began to turn back to history again in his history of sexuality, which he left incomplete. Thus, at the same time, you've got others like Baudrillard who've gone back to bourgeois society completely and now say you can't change anything. And so, have a good time. A message basically that is hedonistic, whether psychologically, intellectually, or just sensuously. And then you've even got the situationists, who many people will hear about sooner or later, who having come out with cries in '68 like workers' councils, and here you encounter, again, mere repetition of slogans that are now long dead, because if there had been workers' councils, they would have been controlled by the communists. Anyone who doubts that for a moment would be kidding himself or herself. And if you had certain of their demands, forget it, have now come out and said that the so-called spectacle, namely the fact that everything is turned into a spectacular, as it were, epiphenomenon of the commodity. You see, no longer a question of the fetishism of the commodity, becomes a fetishism of the spectacle. Namely, the shadow becomes embodied, so to speak, of the commodity and of consumerism. Have now declared that this society is totally hopeless. Not that this is hopeless and ready to be overthrown, but any effort to overthrow it is hopeless. It has now invaded every part of life. And this I wish to deny. I'm saying that it's undergoing that invasion. Whether it can finish that invasion, which I do not believe, or not, the point is one's very individual spirit depends upon resistance. Postmodernism undermines any premises for that resistance. And from my point of view, it is extremely reactionary and has to be, again, unrelentingly challenged and opposed.
Why do you think that postmodernism has become so popular in the universities?
Exactly because I think there is a sense people are looking at this particular point for two things at least, and possibly for three. One of them, of course, it offers great professional opportunities. Now that Derrida has been given an honorary PhD from Cambridge, I was there when the fight took place, by the way, it was hilarious. About, give or take 40% of the professors thought it was an insult to philosophy to give Derrida an honorary PhD, and they had a dividing line. Those who favored that honorary PhD walked on one side of the line, and the others walked on the other side. And Derrida, like Cambridge, is out to get students and get well-to-do students, bent before the wind and before the tide. Today, students find in postmodernism a curious mix. One, it's professionally very rewarding. Two, even those who are not interested in the extent to which it is professionally rewarding, identified with anarchism and personalism. Inasmuch as every organization must produce a bureaucracy, according to many postmodernists, or at least those who were involved in '68, who did that 180-degree turn without critically modulating and modifying dialectically, rationally, why they should oppose the Stalinists in '68, just decided to take the opposite position. To every yay, there was a nay. So today, many people in the universities view in postmodernism several anarchic characteristics. One, postmodernism calls for total spontaneity, as though spontaneity that is not informed doesn't turn out to be more than what I would call an event. Like during the '60s, they had that phenomenon that a happening was the word. It was made to be destroyed. Spontaneity that is not informed, that does not find its own libertarian, and I use this in the leftist sense, form of organization, can be completely manipulated and very frequently burns itself out. And I saw that in the '60s. Feminists will turn to, not all feminists by any means, but a number of feminists will turn to postmodernism merely as a way of declaring that they're anti-patriarchal. Postmodernism is what is not modern. Just like there are many people who call themselves deep ecologists because it's supposed to be deep. The kind of depth they're getting into remains unquestioned because they don't even read, in many cases, the literature that the deep ecologists are turning out today, which is basically anti-human in many respects. Anti-human in a misanthropic sense, in an aversion for human beings, and an attempt to mystify the animal world, non-human animal world. Others will turn to postmodernism, again, because they feel that it's a total break with the past. And they feel that the past right now represents civilization. And with that, they become decivilized, because postmodernism offers them no other program. It offers them no program for social action, and it allows for a great deal of personal introspection, which, going back to the case of the onion, leaves nothing but the smell behind. So these are the attractions, and it's acquired a fad-like quality. Your friends are postmodernists. Anyone who you think is an intellectual is a postmodernist. So you form a gang. There's a kind of groupie mentality about postmodernism. The same thing happened with Jürgen Habermas in the United States. The man has a lip impairment, a mouth impairment, which makes it possible for him to be understandable in German when he just reads the newspaper. He not only has that lip impairment, but he talks with a very heavy German accent when he speaks in English. And then on top of that, his prose is the most abstruse I've encountered since who knows what. Since I read Immanuel Kant. And boring as well. But that's beside the point. The thing is that people are into fads, but these fads are very frequently substitutes for very serious analyses. And by the way, the postmodernists are the anti-totalitarians par excellence, because they identify any kind of coherence with totalitarianism. Hence, if you're consistent, bear this well in mind, you are a potential totalitarianism. You're bringing back some or another form of Stalinism or Hitlerism. Use whatever you want. So incoherence has now become very fat. It's just like MTV. And those two cartoon characters on MTV are very faddish. You know. It's a way, you know what I mean, to insult authority, but at the same time, and I certainly believe that authority must be insulted, to put it mildly, that is no substitute for not having organization, without having coherence, without having a sense of direction. And postmodernism offers no sense of direction. It thus feeds on itself as a fad.
Students, young people, they can't turn to postmodernism to become revolutionaries, and it's difficult to find a radical framework within which to build ideas, to become empowered, to become organized. There's no tradition in the institutions, no Marxist tradition, no anarchist tradition, no general radical tradition where people might have a preferential solidarity with those who are most oppressed. Given that, where do young people today turn to find the radical framework?
In the United States, they can go to the Institute for Social Ecology, where the views that I've expressed are taught. I helped found that in 1974. They can also try to communicate, and I would see to it that they meet kindred types, if they are around, of people who are radical ecologists of one kind or another, and anti-capitalist, and even have a class analysis. And it's very simple. All they have to do is write to my post office box, P.O. Box 111. It's easy to remember, 111. Burlington, Vermont, 05402. And we would be people I'm associated with. We have a group in Burlington, and we have other friends throughout the United States, and indeed throughout the entire world. There's even talk of calling an international conference of social ecologists, which essentially constitute the same designation for anarcho-communists of the type that I have been trying to advance. I should like to make it plain that there are anarchists with whom I disagree as sharply as I do with Michael Parenti. And it's not just a question of being, quotes, by Parenti's standards, anti-communist. It's a question basically of trying to find a coherent ideology. Postmodernism tends very frequently to attract individualistic anarchists, again, who are peeling an onion. And I would disagree with them as much as I would with people like Parenti, or for that matter, I don't know, many other people, deep ecologists and the like.
The difference between anarcho-syndicalism and anarcho-communism has caused conflicts through the years. Can you describe that difference?
Well, the word anarcho-communism means communism, long since identified as from each according to his, her ability, and to each according to his, her needs. In other words, you do what work you can that is required of society as much as you can to the extent that you are into doing it. And you receive what you need to keep yourself alive, to satisfy your needs. One can get silly and say that people who are given the freedom to satisfy their needs will bring in 10 television sets into the room. Well, such people more approximately, people are not that insane. Okay, let's be frank about it. Presupposing such a society, whether Marx or Kropotkin advanced these communistic beliefs, is the idea that there will be enough to meet basic needs. And thereafter, we can negotiate, in a sense, in an open democratic manner, how not basic needs, but other needs that are more than basic, I wouldn't call them superfluous, can be worked out, negotiated, shared. Such a society would be communist also in the very real sense that the means of production are communally owned. They are not the private property. I'm not talking of personal goods, like your watch or your hi-fi set or your TV camera or your TV, anything like that, or your clothing. Nobody's ever proposed that as the ultimate form of communism except certain religious zealots, going back to the Middle Ages perhaps, or even more recently. That's a different story. Now the distinctions, anarcho-communism is ultimately what it is supposed Marx wanted to achieve anyway. What was supposed to be the basic argument between the anarcho-communists and the Marxists, communists that is to say, was how to get there. And Marx, living in the 1850s, 60s, dying in 1883, if I'm not mistaken, Marx felt that you still did not have enough technological development in the world to get things around, to give people the things that they needed in terms of their basic needs, that everyone would have to work. So there would have to be various stages that you went through in order to develop the productive forces, technology. Now the technology is not only developed, it's overdeveloped. You know what I'm saying? It's overdeveloped, beyond being developed, so that these stages now become meaningless, except if Marxists were to respond as means of educating people into a sense of virtue and a sense of cooperation and decency. In other words, undoing the effects of capitalism and of hierarchy, if I were to take it further. Anarcho-communism, in turn, simply says that what is already obviously true, that we don't have to go through these stages, which could lead to an authoritarian development, as they did in the Soviet Union. I believe that Lenin was a genuine revolutionary, but I think the tragedy of Lenin's position was that he held on to a centralist view so overwhelming and so overbearing, in a sense, that he had contempt for democracy. Except inside the party, he had contempt for democracy, and he even banned democracy in the party temporarily, he said, when he forbade factions in the party. But he had a real contempt for democracy, which he regarded basically as a superstructural phenomenon. He was, in these respects, very much a narrow and vulgar Marxist, like certain people I know today. Syndicalism is different. First of all, there's syndicalism without anarcho, and there's anarcho-syndicalism. People like Big Bill Haywood of the IWW was not an anarchist. He was a syndicalist. And even Daniel de Leon had syndicalist views. And that is a very narrow productivist mentality. And that narrow productivist mentality works with the supposition that if you take over the factories and let the union run it, one big union, just taking the crudest syndicalist point of view, then at that particular point you would have a society that was non-capitalist, because the capitalists wouldn't run it, and presumably a union that sought the welfare of the workers, so the workers through the union would run it. Now, you know that that can be fraught with dangers. We have only to see what unions have become now. I mean, the enormous bureaucracy that has simply permeated the labor movement today. If you want to even, doesn't even call itself labor very much. But the anarcho-syndicalists believed in something that was even looser than that. They believed in a great deal of grassroots democracy. So they wanted workers to take over the factory. And the higher up you went in coordinating power in the factory, or for that matter in the land, where the land was collectivized, the less authority any higher layer on that pyramid had, until there was virtually, the authority was mainly coordinated. And the big problem of syndicalism, anarcho-syndicalism, is that it has an enormous Marxist component in that it believes in what is called the hegemony of the proletariat. And that is to say, the proletariat, in a sense, will lead the rest of society, and the real locus of any social struggle occurs in a factory. That's it. In other words, the struggle between wage labor and capital, not just between other forms of social thinking and capital, not any even anti-capitalist sentiments that might exist, say among women, say among people of color, you see, say among all different kinds of ethnic groups and whatever you like, and people of different status situations, but only in the factory. And that is where Parenti really can only say that, I mean, distort my remarks and say what he said, and I don't want to pick on him, frankly, but others do the same. That kind of vulgar economism or productivism excludes a vast percentage of the population, number one, and fails to recognize the extent to which wage labor can be privileged depending upon the country or the strata you're talking about. Wage labor can be privileged. Now maybe today with all the layoffs and firings and plants shuffling around from one country to another, it doesn't seem so. But for a long period of time, the labor movement was, in a sense, privileged. And indeed, workers themselves very explicitly declared the high-paying industrial jobs that we had in Detroit will now go down to either the South, where they'll become low-paying jobs, or will be transported over to Mexico, where they'll be the lowest-paying jobs, and words to that effect. But there you see the mentality that is at work.
Many people
Knocking on the door. You'll have to replay that.
Okay.
Who is it? Joey, hi. Could you sit down for a little while, or you can supervise? My son is an outstanding technician in this field.
Oh, good.
Can I just get a chair for him from over here?
Oh, absolutely, Donnie.
No, I was saying that.
Now to before the knocking?
Okay, I'm going to take care of that later.
Okay.
Many people find it difficult to remain revolutionary for long periods of time. As we mentioned at the beginning, you're in your 73rd year, and still you're a revolutionary. What does it take to remain a revolutionary for the long term?
First of all, your soul. For indeed, verily and truly, more so than if you joined a particular religious group, the importance of resisting the corrosive and irrational environment of capitalism can only take place if you remain a revolutionary and challenge the system and its fundamentals. Now, I'm not trying in any way whatever to sound like an evangelist, but today, as capitalism permeates every pore of the society, you have to continually engage in a struggle, even as an individual, against the irrationalities and the perversities that it continually produces in people who literally finally reach the end of their lives and are prepared to spit in their faces, at least in front of a mirror. It just is appalling what happens to people who give in unless absolutely necessary, like paying your taxes or whatever you like to stay out of jail, who give in to the present social order. Otherwise, it devours you. It changes you right down to the very molecular structure of your cells. And ultimately, you build up extremely unsavory rationalizations for why you're doing what you know to be, at least while you're still young, patently false and patently dehumanizing. So you're really struggling against your dehumanization, in a sense, from capitalism. And if you become fully cognizant of that, then afterward you begin to reinforce that struggle, unless you're prepared to agree that this is the best of all possible worlds. And then look at Somalia, and then look at Bosnia-Herzegovina, and look at what may well happen in many other parts of the world, as almost a mere certainty, and come to terms with the system. So you continually have to struggle against it. Now, what is very important in addition to that is the development of a coherent outlook, which is one of the reasons why postmodernism is so vicious. To bring your ideas together, to show the connections, how one emerges from the other, not to force artificial connections onto the situation, but at least to show, to demonstrate the connections, to make them theoretically coherent so that they have meaning, however irrational they may be. Reinforces your resistance, and partly reinforces your resistance, first of all, because it gives you a sense of meaning to your resistance. You know what's happening. And still, secondly, gives you the only basis for hope that will totally change the society, for a hope that will lead you to strive to change the society. So you're fighting, first of all, for your very humanity in being a revolutionary, because otherwise capitalism blankets everything. If it could take up Ben and Jerry, take it from me, it will take up any postmodernist lecturer in one university or another, or any youngster, who looks at MTV. if finally, in addition to all of these two reasons, it alone offers you a basis for a hope, if not in your own lifetime, then at least sometime in the future. And it gives you a sense of direction about what the future can be, not merely what the future is, or seems to be, because of the way things are today. And this involves a way of thinking. This is what I call dialectical naturalism. I build my ideas on the potentialities of human beings. In no small measure, these potentialities are simply my own private potentialities. If I believe in freedom, and I've tried to define it, if I believe in self-consciousness, if I believe in cooperation, if I have an ethics of complementarity, why can't anyone else have it? What are the circumstances that entered into my life that should make me something very special? I believe that this is something that everyone can have, provided that they are educated, provided that they are informed, provided they look at the reality that they inquire not through a television screen, but through genuine experience. A second thing is, having looked at the potentialities of human beings to cooperate, and I can go back into history and show marvelous examples of this, and to be free, I can show marvelous examples of that as well, small as they may be, incidental or marginal as they may be, and to have an ethics of complementarity in which people feel they're complementing, not dominating each other. Then afterward I say that this lies within the realm of human potentiality. Now, what are the conditions that could make these potentialities unfold in the same sense that a child unfolds from a fetus, becomes a baby, and then after it becomes a child and becomes an adolescent, prepubescent, adolescent, and so on, all the phases of life. And if I try to reason that out, and that's where dialectical reasoning is important, thinking organically in a sense, not simply geometrically, within a mere ordinary time-space framework where the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, but more in terms of self-development and self-actualization, and not simply self, but social development and social actualization. I thereby develop the moral basis for a critique of the society. After all, if there is no rationality in the world, who am I to call this world irrational? If there isn't justice in this world, or freedom in this world, at least insofar as speculative thought working out from real potentialities in human beings, the rational unfolding of their possibilities to its full actualization, who am I to say that any society is unfree? If I don't know what ought to be because it is rational, and through a process of reasoning that is dialectical or organic, if I don't know what justice and freedom mean, or consciousness means, who am I to say that this society is unconscious, that this society is unfree, and this society is unjust? All of this, and this lies at the basis of all my thinking, what I've called this dialectic of reasoning out these potentialities, and recognizing that thought can go beyond reality as it exists, that the what ought to be stands as an abiding challenge of the what is. If that tension does not exist, then I succumb to the what is. I become what is called a realist. Now let me give you the story of a realist. I have a chap whom I know called Joschka Fischer. When I first met him, I believe he was a taxi cab driver. He lived in Frankfurt, and he was more revolutionary than thou. How you couldn't compare with him. After all, driving in a taxi cab, living this vagrant gypsy life, making his livelihood where he could, dressed in shabbiest clothing, God knows what, and preaching, the need. Spanti is what he called himself, a Spanti. Before there were autonomes, there were Spantis, okay, in Germany. Dressing in black. Joschka would go around and say, what, you're going to the university, you're becoming a lawyer? With civil rights. There are no civil rights under this system. Why defend them? You only make the system work better. Great. Joschka put me to shame. Then guess what happened? Joschka decided, together with Danny Cohn-Bendit, the Red, to join the Green Party, the Grünen. They came to the conclusion capitalism is here to stay. So what can we do that is socially valuable? What we can do, and I think this is a terribly important lesson, is we join the system as leftists. We join the Green Party and we say capitalism is here to stay, but let's make it the best possible capitalism we can have. Not only in terms of the capitalists, but in terms of ordinary people. So they became leaders of the Greens, and they drove out the revolutionaries in a bitter fight. Okay? They were driven out. Then they took over the party, they and a few others like them. They took over the Green Party. And then Yoshka said, well, if I'm going to improve the capitalist system and make it better, more democratic, more ecological, I should run for public office. Okay, if you ran for public office in Frankfurt, it would be one thing. You see, you'd be under people's eyes. You could be controlled. You could be turned out of office, especially if you had councils all around you, or assemblies to control you. You know, a libertarian municipalist approach. No. He went ahead and he ran for the city council. He got elected. Then afterward, the Greens put him up for the Hessian Lande, the Landtag, which is the equivalent of the state government. I don't mean the federal government, the state government. So he ran there. And before long, he decided the best thing he can ultimately do to fulfill all his dreams about improving capitalism was to become the environmental minister. So he became the environmental minister. Now, several problems arose. First, they wanted to ship the waste around Frankfurt or in Hesse over to Bremen. And the Greens there said, why are you sending us your nuclear junk? Greens poisoning the environment of other Greens? They said it's unparty-like. Then afterward, in the meantime, he got increasingly corpulent until he's, I don't know, somewhere in the range of about 350 pounds now. And he started dressing up because, after all, you can't be a minister, you know, without having a tie and a shirt. If you could find the necktie, you know, get around them. And he started showing reporters his various bedrooms, one in the capital city of Hesse, and the other one in Berlin, because he's also in Bonn, because he's also on the Senate, you see. And it went on and on and on like this. And then afterward, he called for unification with working together with the SPD, Social Democrats. And the Social Democrats for a while were prepared to embrace him and talked about sharing the government. And they did share the government in Hesse to keep the right-wing CDU out, which would be the equivalent of the Republican Party. Now the Social Democrats, number one, don't want him. Why? Because environment is a dirty word compared to jobs, besides which they took over the environmental program, considering that it was a reformist program, since, after all, Yoshka was not fighting the system, he was trying to make the system work better. So it was easy, you took it over. Then the Greens had a kind of dark, sinister origin. I don't, you know, they were on the left. They were reputed to be on the left, even though they said neither left nor right but forward. Okay. So the SPD decided the Greens are going to be a liability, that they get only 4% of the crossover vote from the Greens, whereas in point of fact they could get 14% of the vote from the CDU if they disallowed the Greens. So the SPD has just recently come out and declared it doesn't want to have anything to do with Yoshka, the Social Democrats. So now Yoshka has, I'm just told, a bright idea. And it isn't the first time it's been voiced in the Greens. We're going to work with the equivalent of the Republican Party. Why? What are you going to hold? You're going to hold an office, you're going to hold 2 bedrooms, 2 offices, and you're going to keep gaining weight? It's going to kill you anyway. I feel like sending him a carton of Ben & Jerry's ice creams on a regular basis. I don't want to be vindictive toward either of them. I just want to show you this lesser evil of policy which leads you to a greater and greater and greater evil. And the system puts you exactly in that corner. Germany is a historical example of that. The Social Democrats took over the government in 1919 by crushing the extreme left, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who were the founders of the German Communist Party before Stalin came around. Then after that, the Social Democrats had to make a deal with the Center Party, okay? Because if they didn't deal with the Center Party, then the Conservative Party would come along. Then afterward, the German Social Democrats, going through the 1920s, had to deal now with the Conservative Party, because if the Conservative Party didn't win, Hitler would win. And finally, they voted for the Conservative Party, and guess what happened? Hitler was appointed chancellor, and they were suppressed. This politics of lesser evil, this ethics of lesser evil, appalls me. And I feel very critical of it. So this whole ensemble of views that I presented, and I don't think that you can present one-liners without being utterly superficial, represent the reasons why it is important to remain a revolutionary, and very importantly, why it is terribly important to form a revolutionary movement. I don't mean going back to the 1935s and 36s of my generation when I was young. I certainly believe that one should reclaim from every period what is valid. But the point is, above all, to recognize how much is at stake the moment one gives up this revolutionary commitment, and the knowledge that must go with it to reinforce the commitment, and the experience, particularly of people like Joschka, or particularly of the SPD, the German Social Democrats, between 1919 and 1933, when Hitler finally crushed them. And that is what keeps me alive right up to 73, more or less. That name. And now, you know, is in San Francisco instead of being in Chicago, which is where it originally was located. And so quite naturally, I assimilated a good many revolutionary notions, becoming an atheist at the age of 6, a vegetarian between 6 and 14. These ideals were very ubiquitous all over. They were present all over the place. Listened continually and learned stories and accounts about the Russian Revolution by people who fought in it, not just people who read about it in newspapers or in books. And by the age of 9 or so, I was actually recruited. 1930, no later than 1931, I was actually recruited in the children's organization of the Communist Party, the Young Pioneers of America, and went through that in one of the most hectic periods of American communism. That period was one of continual insurgency. The Communist Party and the Communist International, despite the fact that Stalin was coming to power, and his power wasn't absolutely assured as yet. It was not to be assured until 5 or 6 years later, with the Moscow trials, when he killed off all the old Bolsheviks. But before that period, between, say, 1930 or 31 and 1935, the United States, the Communist Party and the Communist movement generally in the United States was in its most insurrectionary phase. We'd go from one demonstration to another demonstration and fight the police in New York City. And with the Depression, we had great hunger marches. Thousands would rally in various parts of New York and march towards City Hall, New York City Hall, with bread banners and slogans like, "We want bread, not war," or "We want butter, not guns." Slogans that you could have heard in 1848 or in 1789 in the French Revolution. In other words, it was easier for us in those days to communicate more comfortably with someone who had been on the June barricades in Paris, workers who had been on the June barricades in Paris under the red flags of 1848, than it would have been to talk to someone today, or even to, you know, contemporaries or people younger, a generation later than my own, or 2 generations later than my own, who were to make up the new left. So that old left that everybody talks about had some very limiting features about it, but it also had enormously expansive features about it. It had a rich musical heritage. It felt it was really completing the French Revolution of 1789 to 1794. And we all modeled ourselves, even the Bolsheviks in Russia modeled ourselves on the French Revolution, the whole cycle of the revolution. We thought in terms of a class struggle of the working class, the proletariat, industrial proletariat, which was very numerous at that point in the United States. In the 1920s, the assembly line had come in. We didn't have that before, not quite in the form that Henry Ford produced. And workers and unions and everything like that, and workers' parties, the word worker, proletarian, was on everybody's lips. So it was a period in which we had a very coherent analysis of the working class taking power, establishing a proletarian dictatorship, which we thought would be more democratic, in fact, than the American Bill of Rights, for example, because now the people would control the press, not the oligarchical few capitalists. And we saw workers in action. They were really doing revolutionary things, so it seemed to us. It's not only that they were going out on strike, it's not only that workers were very deeply class conscious, an amazing phenomenon that people have forgotten about today. Workers knew that they were workers. They called themselves labor. They called themselves workers, and in the most radical cases they called themselves proletarians, and that would not have been alien to most workers in industry, mines, in many cases even craft-type workers. We used to have cigar workers working right out in the open in little cigar stores, wrapping leaves of tobacco. We had craftsmen all around. We didn't have, incidentally, the giant supermarkets and the corporate type of retail outlets that we have today. In those days, everything was a mom-and-pop store, and you knew everyone in the neighborhood. We also had open-air meetings, soapbox meetings, as they used to be called, where regularly, almost every day of the week, if the weather was reasonably clement, somebody would be on a stand talking about revolutionary ideas and talking about all kinds of class issues, dealing with class struggle, with socialism, with communism. And unfortunately, at that point, we didn't have very much anarchism around. The anarchist movement had more or less been overshadowed by the communists and the socialists. Remember well that in 1932, in the depths of the Depression, Norman Thomas, the socialist candidate for president, got more votes, almost 1 million votes, than Eugene V. Debs did in 1912, which was regarded as the heyday of American socialism, and that the communists got another 160 or 170,000. So you see, these were big, sizable movements that were very much in the public eye, however small the membership was. And also, finally, in the 1930s, it seemed like everything was going to be fulfilled. All our dreams as Marxists and as revolutionaries were going to be fulfilled. Terrible as the Depression was for so many people in the United States, for us it was something different that had meaning. The Depression, despite the economic deprivation every one of us felt very personally, and I saw my furniture in the house out on the street every 3 months because of rental evictions, which was a standard routine during the Depression. At times you'd see a whole block covered, the sidewalks covered with the furniture of people who were being evicted from their apartments for non-payment of rent. And I knew what it meant to go hungry, even for several days. The point is that despite this kind of material deprivation that many of us radicals in those days felt, particularly communists and socialists, and I guess anarchists, they didn't have radios and they didn't have television sets. So people continually mingled with each other. There was a very rich street life, and there was a very rich radical choral groups. There were very rich, very attractive lectures being given. Emma Goldman would come around, Eugene V. Debs would come around, Big Bill Haywood of the IWW would come around and continually lecture, as well as less luminous figures in those days. And in a great sense, in a very real sense, I guess they were part of the Russian workers' movement. And when, of course, the Russian Bolsheviks took over under Lenin and Trotsky, everybody became a Bolshevik. It didn't make any difference whether you were a Marxist or an anarchist or a social democrat, if you were enthusiastic about the overthrow of the Tsar and the Red Flag and the Internationale, which became the official anthem of the newly emerging Soviet Union, you became a Bolshevik. You didn't have to read too much about it to know which side you were on. So when I was born, at the very beginning of 1921, and while the revolution, in effect, was still going on to some extent, I was completely suffused in this whole atmosphere of revolutionary dreams, very revolutionary visions, people talking enthusiastically about what was happening in the world, because it seemed like the world was going to transform itself completely. And I felt that energy which remained with me well through the 1920s. In fact, the very first language, even though I was born in the United States, that I could speak with any fluency was Russian, which I've totally forgotten by and large. And the heroes and heroines that I saw all around me were pictures of Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht in the German Revolution, heroic figures from the Russian Revolution and the Russian revolutionary past. In fact, before I even knew the name of Robin Hood, I heard of Stenka Razin, who rose up in the 1600s against Tsarism, the Russian Cossack who led great masses of people against Tsarism, and then still later, a century or so, Emelian Pugachev's great uprising. And so I had a better picture of revolutions in Russia than I did of anything in the United States, which ultimately, of course, so far as the United States is concerned, I gradually assimilated as I went to school and began to mingle with also first-generation Americans, generally in a Jewish, socialist, or communist neighborhood of New York. New York at that time was made up of 1,000 villages. My parents, in point of fact, both father and mother, were proletarians in the real sense of the word. They worked in the garment district at a time when the unions were being organized. And they were also members of the Industrial Workers of the World when it was still the Industrial Workers of the World and not a mere remnant or a shadow of what exists today under
Vermont, talking with Murray Bookchin. And Murray, you're in your 73rd year, and you've been a revolutionary since the 1930s. You were talking earlier about handing out pamphlets in the streets during the labor movement. You were in Spain in the 60s doing research on the Spanish anarchist movement.
In the 60s.
In the 60s, yes. Could you share with us some of your background, how you became involved in revolutionary activities?
Well, I'd say that my revolutionary experience, if I can use that, goes back practically to Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution. In fact, even before the 1905 revolution in Russia. I can't say how long my family was living in southern Russia. It may have been every bit of 500 to 1,000 years, I don't know. But I was very greatly influenced, quite obviously, by my grandparents, and particularly by my grandmother, who was born around 1860, way back in what is today called Moldavia, but in her day was called Bessarabia. It was under Tsarist control. And they lived on the border of Romania, or possibly Austro-Hungary, it was called, Austria-Hungary. And in those days, back in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, into the 1890s, they had a movement called the Narodniki, which meant the populace. They're most famous, for example, for having executed Alexander II. They were called the People's Will, Narodnaya Volya. And my grandmother, however far removed she was from the center of Russia, possibly about 1,500 miles away from Moscow, or what was then later on to be called Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and Leningrad, be another 2,000 miles, nonetheless belonged to that whole movement of the Jews emancipating themselves from tradition, the Jewish Enlightenment it was called, or the Haskalah. And both she and my grandfather, whom I never knew, were Russian socialists, populist socialists, sort of on the anarchistic side. And they migrated, both my grandmother, after my grandfather died, and my mother and her brother, my uncle, to the Lower East Side, where they became more involved in the Russian labor movement, emigrant labor movement, than in the Yiddish or Jewish traditions of the Lower East Side. And they belonged to Russian workers' clubs, choruses. There was a very rich life that unfortunately we no longer know in our own time today in the 1990s. They didn't have telephones, they didn't have typewriters. We still felt exhilarated. In 1934, for example, the Austrian workers broke out in an insurrection. Workers, classical socialist party workers in Vienna, raised red flags and fought against the Dollfuss regime, which suppressed their insurrection. You see a touch of that in the movie Julia, when Jane Fonda comes to Vienna, and you see the workers with their hands on their heads and guarded by the steel helmets, as they were called. And then again, you had another insurrection about 8 months later in Spain. I'm not talking of the Spanish Civil War, I'm talking of the uprising of the Asturian coal miners, who held cities like Oviedo for 3 weeks against the Spanish Foreign Legion, one of the most brutal military forces that existed in the world at that time. We felt the upheavals going on in Germany, and we had echoes of Italian anti-fascists who had fought Mussolini and were in exile. And then, of course, came that greatest of all events, one of the greatest in history, in my opinion, one of the very greatest, the Spanish Revolution of 1936, when one of the biggest anarcho-syndicalist movements, the CNT, National Confederation of Labor, with its anarchist adjunct, or vanguard, if you like, and they use the words, anarchists use the words vanguard, words like vanguard, the FAI, or the Iberian Anarchist Federation, which altogether probably influenced at least 1 million people out of 24 million. I mean, where do you find an anarcho-syndicalist movement that large with its black and red flag, which has since been emulated in Latin America by the Sandinistas and others? The black standing for anarchy, the red standing for syndicalism, or workers' control of the factories. I mean, they collectivized a huge portion of the Republican area in the northeast of Spain, put it in established workers' control, established workers' committees to take over factories. In fact, the greater part of the factories in Catalonia, the northeastern stronghold of the anarcho-syndicalists, were taken over by the unions. See, and private property, to the extent that it existed, was very carefully controlled. Those inspiring events shaped our outlook so that when the war came, we expected that the Second World War would be a continuation of the First World War. We thought it was just another imperialist war, and we were indoctrinated into believing. By this time, by the way, I had broken with the Stalinists, the Communist Party, and I drifted over to Trotskyism. But we thought at that point, by 1939 and 1940, that the Second World War wouldn't even last as long as the First World War, that it would end as the First World War had in workers' insurrections. In fact, we saw in the darkness of the Second World War the beginning, we thought, of the glow of a new society. This would be it, the end of capitalism. Capitalism had gone through its chronic crisis of the 1930s, as Marx had predicted, and now, steeled with the more advanced ideas than even existed before the First World War, no longer